The scream echoed through the frozen forest, cutting the silence like a sharp blade. Bjorn Ironside stopped in his tracks, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. It wasn't a human scream. It was something older, more dangerous. The runes on his skin began to glow, pulsing in a frantic rhythm. Something was wrong, very wrong. As darkness thickened around him, Bjorn realized he was no longer alone in the forest. Shadows moved between the trees, too fast to be common animals. The air grew heavy, charged with an ancient and evil energy. Suddenly a whisper reached his ears, the words chilling his blood. The Fenris wolf has broken free. Ragnarok has begun. Bjorn knew this moment would change everything. The battle for the fate of the 9 worlds was about to begin, and he was at the center of it. With his hand on the hilt of his sword, he prepared to face whatever emerged from the shadows. Hello, warriors and shield maidens. Welcome to the channel. Before we embark on today's saga, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments, tell me which distant land or city you're watching this video from. Let us see how far our tale has traveled across the world. Smash the like button and subscribe to our tribe. All this because the wind howled like 1,000 hungry wolves, driving needles of ice into Bjorn's face as he stumbled through the blinding snowstorm. His fingers, numb within his fur-lined gloves, clutched desperately at the haft of his axe. The weapon, which had always felt like an extension of his arm, now seemed as heavy as a millstone around his neck. Odin's beard, he cursed through chattering teeth. What I wouldn't give for a warm hearth and a horn of mead. But there was no hearth, no mead, and no shelter in sight. Just an endless expanse of white, broken only by the occasional dark smudge of a snow-laden pine. Bjorn had been separated from his war party 3 days ago, ambushed by Saxons in a narrow valley. The battle had been fierce but brief. In the chaos, he'd been forced over a cliff's edge, tumbling down into a river swollen with spring melt. The current had carried him far from familiar territory, depositing him on a foreign shore like so much driftwood. Since then, he'd been walking, hoping to find some landmark, some sign of civilization. But this accursed storm had other plans. Bjorn's foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow, and he pitched forward, face first into a drift. For a moment he lay there, the cold seeping into his bones, whispering seductive promises of rest. No, he growled, pushing himself up onto his knees. I will not die here, unmourned and unremembered. The skalds will not sing of Bjorn Ironside, felled by a snowflake. With a grunt of effort he regained his feet, squinting against the driving snow. And that's when he saw it. A dark mass looming ahead, too large and too still to be anything but shelter. Hope surged through him, lending strength to his leaden limbs. Bjorn forged ahead, each step a battle against the wind and his own exhaustion. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a stand of ancient trees, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a natural barrier against the storm. Thank you, Freya, Bjorn muttered, stumbling into the relative calm of the grove. Though I doubt even your charms could warm me now. The sudden absence of howling wind was shocking, leaving Bjorn's ears ringing in the muffled silence. Snow still fell, but gently here, sifting through the canopy above like flour through a sieve. Bjorn moved deeper into the grove, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. And then he saw it. At the heart of the grove stood a tree unlike any Bjorn had ever seen. Its trunk was massive, easily as wide as 10 men standing shoulder to shoulder. Its bark was the color of old silver, etched with patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the dim light. But most impressive were its branches stretching up and out in every direction, disappearing into the storm-dark sky above. Bjorn approached the tree slowly, a sense of awe overcoming his exhaustion. He reached out, pressing his palm against the trunk. The bark was warm to the touch, thrumming with what felt like a heartbeat. "What manner of tree are you?" he whispered. As if in response, a gust of wind swept through the grove, shaking loose a cascade of leaves. They spiraled down around Bjorn, not the green of summer or the gold of autumn, but a shimmering, otherworldly silver. Bjorn caught one, marveling at its delicate veins and the way it seemed to glow faintly in his hand. "Truly, I have stumbled into some godly realm," he murmured. The storm still raged beyond the grove, but here, in the shadow of this impossible tree, Bjorn felt a sense of peace settle over him. He sank down at its base, his back pressed against the warm trunk. "I don't suppose you'd object to a weary traveler resting here for a while?" Bjorn asked the tree, a wry smile tugging at his lips. The branches above him swayed gently, as if in welcome. As Bjorn's eyes grew heavy, he found himself speaking aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been having dreams, you know. Dark dreams. I see my village in flames, hear the screams of my people. Something is coming, something terrible. But what can one man do against the tide of fate?" He wasn't sure if it was the warmth of the tree at his back or simply his utter exhaustion, but sleep claimed Bjorn swiftly, and with sleep came dreams. He stood in a great hall, its walls made of living wood that pulsed with an inner light. Before him stretched the branches of an immense tree, each limb a world unto itself. Voices whispered all around him, speaking in a language both familiar and utterly alien. "Bjorn Ironside," the voices said, or perhaps it was just one voice, impossible, ancient, and powerful. "You stand at the crossroads of destiny." "Who are you?" Bjorn demanded, reaching for his axe only to find it gone. "What is this place?" "We are the echoes of what was and what will be," the voice replied. "You stand before Yggdrasil, the world tree, the axis upon which all realms turn." Images flashed before Bjorn's eyes, his village in flames, dark shapes moving among the ruins. He saw armies clashing beneath a sky choked with ash, and a monstrous wolf with jaws that could swallow the sun. "Your people stand on the brink of annihilation," the voice continued. "The Fenris wolf stirs in his prison, and with him comes the twilight of the gods. But fate is not yet set in stone." Bjorn's heart raced, his mind reeling from the visions. "What would you have me do?" "I'm just one man." "You are more than that, Bjorn Ironside. You are a seed of hope, a spark in the darkness. The path ahead is fraught with peril, but if you have the courage to walk it, you may yet change the course of destiny." "And if I refuse?" Bjorn asked, already knowing the answer. The voice grew stern. "Then all you love will perish, and the 9 worlds will fall to chaos and darkness." Bjorn stood silent for a long moment, weighing the enormity of what was being asked of him. Finally, he squared his shoulders and met the gaze of the unseen presence. "I am no hero from the sagas," he said, "but I will not stand idle while my people suffer. Tell me what I must do." A sense of approval radiated through the hall. "Your journey begins now, Bjorn Ironside. Heed well the whispers of Yggdrasil, for they will guide your path." The dream began to fade, the great hall dissolving around him. But before Bjorn woke, he felt a searing pain across his chest and arms, as if he were being branded by white-hot iron. Bjorn's eyes snapped open with a gasp, his hand flying to his chest. The pain was already fading, but as he looked down, he saw strange runes etched into his skin, glowing with a pale, ethereal light. "By all the gods," he breathed. A rustling sound drew his attention, and Bjorn looked up to see a figure standing before him. It was difficult to focus on, its form shifting and blurring like smoke in the wind. But its eyes were clear, ancient, wise, and filled with both sorrow and hope. "The mark of Yggdrasil is upon you now, Bjorn Ironside," the figure said, its voice the same as the one from his dream. "A great and terrible task lies ahead. Are you prepared to meet it?" Bjorn rose to his feet, feeling stronger and more alive than he had in years. The runes on his skin pulsed in time with his heartbeat, filling him with a sense of purpose he'd never known before. "I am," he said, his voice firm with resolve. The figure nodded, already beginning to fade. "Then go. Return to your people. The whispers of Yggdrasil will guide you, but the choices must be your own." The fate of all worlds rests in your hands, Bjorn Ironside. Do not falter." And with that, the figure was gone, leaving Bjorn alone in the grove. The storm outside had passed, the world beyond the trees bright with new fallen snow. Bjorn took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as he prepared to step out of the shelter of Yggdrasil's branches. "Well," he said to himself, a grim smile playing across his lips. "It seems the Skalds will have a tale to sing after all." With one last glance at the great ash tree that had forever changed his destiny, Bjorn strode out of the grove, his path now clear before him. The stench hit Bjorn before he crested the final hill overlooking his village. It was the unmistakable odor of death and decay, carried on a wind that seemed to whisper dark omens. His heart sank as he quickened his pace, the runes on his skin pulsing with an urgent, almost painful intensity. As he entered the village, the full extent of the devastation became clear. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some in doorways, others in the muddy streets. Those still living moved like ghosts, hollow-eyed and gaunt. "Bjorn, by the gods, is that you?" He turned to see Ingrid, the village healer, stumbling towards him. Her once beautiful face was haggard, deep lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes. "Ingrid," Bjorn said, catching her as she nearly collapsed. "What happened here?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "A plague, unlike any I've ever seen. It came on suddenly, 3 days past. We've lost so many." Bjorn's mind raced. 3 days. The same day he had encountered Yggdrasil. Surely it couldn't be a coincidence. "Where are the elders?" he asked. "I must speak with them immediately." Ingrid pointed towards the great hall. "Those who still live are there, trying to decide what to do. But Bjorn," she grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading, "if you have some way to help us, some cure." He placed a hand over hers. "I will do what I can, Ingrid. I swear it." The great hall was thick with smoke and the murmur of worried voices. As Bjorn entered, conversations died away, replaced by gasps and whispers. "Bjorn Ironside," Halfdan the elder wheezed from his seat at the head of the hall. "We had thought you lost." "I very nearly was," Bjorn replied, striding forward. "But fate, it seems, had other plans for me." He recounted his tale, the storm, the magical ash tree, the visions, and the task laid upon him by the spirit of Yggdrasil. As he spoke, he bared his arms and chest, showing the glowing runes etched into his skin. When he finished, silence reigned for a long moment. Then unexpectedly, laughter erupted from several of the elders. "Madness!" cried Ulf the Black. "You expect us to believe this nonsense about magic trees and spirit visions?" Halfdan held up a hand, silencing the others. His rheumy eyes studied Bjorn carefully. "Those marks, they are unlike any runes I've ever seen. But Bjorn, surely you must see how this sounds to our ears. We are a people beset by plague and death. We need real solutions, not fairy stories." Bjorn felt anger rising within him. "You think I would make this up? That I would return to my people with lies in a time of crisis?" "Not lies, perhaps," said Thorvald, the village's most respected warrior, "but maybe delusions brought on by your ordeal. Or worse," his eyes narrowed, "perhaps you've been cursed and now you bring that curse to us." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. Bjorn saw fear and suspicion in the eyes around him, and for a moment, doubt crept into his heart. Was he truly their savior, or just a madman leading them to further ruin? But then the runes flared, filling him with renewed purpose. He straightened, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "Think what you will of me and my tale, but know this. I have been given a task to save not just our village but all our people. I intend to see it through, with or without your blessing." His words seemed to hang in the air, and Bjorn saw something change in the faces of some of the younger warriors present. Hope, long absent, began to kindle in their eyes. One of them, a young man named Eric, stepped forward. "I believe you, Bjorn Ironside. If you seek to save our people, then my axe is yours." Others joined him, Frida the Swift, Gunnar Broadaxe, Sina Shield Maiden. Within moments, a dozen young warriors had pledged themselves to Bjorn's cause. Halfdan sighed heavily. You would lead these young fools to their deaths on nothing more than a madman's dream? I would lead them to glory and the salvation of our people, Bjorn countered, which is more than sitting here waiting for death can offer them. Before Halfdan could respond, the hall's doors burst open. In strode Håkon the Fair, Bjorn's childhood rival and the village's most skilled warrior after Thorvald. So, Håkon sneered, his handsome face twisted with disdain, the prodigal son returns, spouting tales of magic trees and heroic quests. And these addled fools, he gestured to Bjorn's new followers, are actually foolish enough to believe you. Bjorn met Håkon's gaze steadily. Your quarrel is with me, Håkon. Leave them out of it. Håkon's hand went to the hilt of his sword. Oh, I intend to. I challenge you, Bjorn Ironside, to Holmgang. Let us see if your magical runes can stand against cold steel. A hush fell over the hall. To refuse a formal challenge would be to admit cowardice, destroying any chance Bjorn had of leading his people. I accept, Bjorn said quietly, though I take no pleasure in it. The village gathered in a circle on the outskirts of town, eager for any distraction from their woes. Bjorn and Håkon faced each other, swords at the ready. Still time to admit your lies and leave in shame, Håkon taunted. It would save me the trouble of killing you. Bjorn said nothing, letting his sword answer for him as Håkon launched into a furious attack. The clash of steel rang out across the field as the two warriors danced their deadly duet. Håkon was good, very good. His blade seemed to be everywhere at once, pressing Bjorn back with a relentless assault. But as the fight wore on, Bjorn felt a strange calm settle over him. The runes on his skin hummed with energy, and suddenly Håkon's moves seemed to come in slow motion. With a twist and a thrust, Bjorn disarmed his opponent, sending Håkon's sword spinning away. The point of Bjorn's blade rested at Håkon's throat. Well? Håkon spat. Finish it. Bjorn studied his fallen rival for a long moment. Then, to the shock of all present, he lowered his sword. No, he said. There has been enough death in our village. I will not add to it. He turned to address the crowd. I leave at dawn to seek the salvation of our people. Any who would join me are welcome. As for the rest, his eyes swept over the elders, Håkon and the other doubters. I pray to the gods that I am successful, for all our sakes. As the crowd dispersed, Bjorn felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Eirik, the young warrior who had first pledged to follow him. That was well done, Eirik said. You've shown them you're not just strong, but merciful too. It will not be forgotten. Bjorn nodded, though his eyes were drawn to Håkon, who was being helped away by his friends. The look of hatred in Håkon's eyes told Bjorn that while he may have won the duel, he had made a dangerous enemy. As the sun set on the plagued village, Bjorn retreated to his family's old homestead to prepare for the journey ahead. The weight of his people's fate settled heavily upon his shoulders. He was no longer just Bjorn Ironside, the skilled warrior. He was their reluctant hero, the one upon whom all their hopes now rested. Sleep did not come easily that night, and when it did, Bjorn's dreams were filled with the whispers of Yggdrasil, guiding him towards a destiny he could scarcely comprehend. The wind howled across the barren expanse of ice, driving needles of snow into the faces of Bjorn and his band of followers. They had been traveling for days, pushing ever northward into lands that seemed forsaken by gods and men alike. Bjorn trudged at the head of the group, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter or danger. The runes on his skin pulsed with a dull, constant ache, as if warning him of trials yet to come. Bjorn, Frida the Swift called out, her voice barely audible above the wind. We cannot go on like this much longer. The men are exhausted and our supplies run low. Bjorn turned to survey his small band. Their faces were gaunt and wind-burned, eyes hollow with fatigue and doubt. He felt the weight of their trust upon him, heavier than any armor he had ever worn. We'll rest soon, he shouted back. There's an ice ridge ahead. It should provide some shelter from this accursed wind. As they struggled towards the promise of respite, Gunnar Broadaxe fell to his knees, his massive frame shaking with cold and exhaustion. "Leave me," he gasped as Eric tried to help him up. "I'm only slowing you down." Bjorn strode back to the fallen warrior, kneeling beside him. "On your feet, Gunnar. I'll not lose a single one of you to this frozen hell." "Why?" Gunnar's eyes met Bjorn's, filled with a mixture of despair and anger. "Why are we here, Bjorn? Chasing visions and myths while our people suffer back home?" For a moment Bjorn said nothing, feeling the doubts of his followers pressing in around him like the ever-present cold. Then he stood, addressing them all. "I know you doubt. I know you fear. But I swear to you by all the gods, by Yggdrasil itself, that our journey has purpose. Our people's salvation lies ahead, and I will see it done or die in the attempt." As if in response to his words, the runes on his skin flared briefly, sending a wave of warmth through his body. The others gasped, seeing the otherworldly glow even through his furs. "Now," Bjorn said, helping Gunnar to his feet. "Let's find that shelter." They had just reached the lee of the ice ridge when Sina Shieldmaiden cried out in alarm. "Look! On the ridge!" Massive shapes loomed above them, easily twice the height of a man. As they drew closer, features became clear. Blue-white skin, eyes like chips of ice, and teeth filed to wicked points. "Frost giants," Bjorn breathed, his hand going to his sword. "Everyone, back slowly. No sudden moves." But retreat was impossible. More giants appeared behind them, cutting off any escape. They were surrounded. The largest of the frost giants, a scarred behemoth with a necklace of human skulls, stepped forward. When it spoke, its voice was like the cracking of glaciers. "What brings little humans to our realm?" it rumbled. "Perhaps you wish to become part of our next feast?" Bjorn stepped forward, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run. "We seek passage through your lands, mighty one. We mean no harm or disrespect to you and yours." The giant's laughter shook snow from the nearby ice formations. Brave words from one so small. "But passage through our realm comes at a price. Are you willing to pay it, little human?" Bjorn felt the eyes of his followers upon him. Their lives hung on his next words. "Name your price," he said. The giant's eyes gleamed with cruel mirth. "A game, then. Answer my riddles 3. Answer truly, and you may pass. Fail, and your bones will decorate my hall." Bjorn nodded, his mouth dry. "Ask your riddles, Frost Giant, I am ready." The giant grinned, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. "First riddle, I am not alive, but I grow. I don't have lungs, but I need air. I don't have a mouth, but water kills me. What am I?" Bjorn's mind raced, acutely aware of the lives depending on his answer. Then, unbidden, came a whisper in his mind, like the rustle of leaves in a sacred grove. "Fire," he said aloud. "The answer is fire." The giant's eyes narrowed. "Correct. Second riddle, I have cities but no houses. I have mountains but no trees. I have water but no fish. What am I?" Again, the whisper came to Bjorn, and he answered without hesitation. "A map," the giant growled, clearly displeased. "Final riddle, human. What is always on its way here but never arrives?" This time, no whisper came to aid Bjorn. He stood in silence, aware of every heartbeat, every gust of wind. His followers held their breath, their fate hanging on his answer. Then Bjorn smiled. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow is always on its way, but never arrives." For a long moment, silence reigned. Then the giant threw back its head and roared with laughter. "Well played, little human. You may pass, but know this. The dangers ahead make us frost giants seem like mewling babes. You go to your doom." As the giants parted to let them pass, Bjorn felt a mix of relief and foreboding wash over him. They had survived this encounter, but at what cost? And what greater perils lay ahead? They had traveled for perhaps another hour when Bjorn noticed Leif, one of the younger warriors, lagging behind the group. There was something furtive in the way he kept glancing over his shoulder. Before Bjorn could confront him, a war cry split the air. From behind snow-covered boulders sprang a band of warriors, their blue-painted faces marking them as members of a rival clan. "Ambush!" Bjorn roared, drawing his sword. But even as he did, he saw Leif running towards the attackers, a look of shame on his face. "Traitor!" Frida cried, knocking an arrow to her bow. The battle was swift and brutal. Outnumbered and caught by surprise, Bjorn's followers fought desperately, but they were no match for the well-prepared ambushers. As Bjorn saw his friends falling around him, something snapped inside him. The runes on his skin blazed to life, filling him with power he had never known. His sword became a blur of motion, cutting down foes with inhuman speed and strength. The attackers, seeing their easy prey transformed into an unstoppable warrior, broke and ran. Within moments, the battlefield was silent, save for the moans of the wounded and dying. Bjorn stood panting, the power fading from his limbs, leaving him drained and shaking. He looked around at the carnage, his heart heavy. They had survived, but at a terrible cost. In the distance, he saw a lone figure fleeing across the snow, Leif, the traitor who had led them into this trap. Bjorn took a step in pursuit, the desire for vengeance burning in his chest. But then he heard Eric calling out to him. "Bjorn, Gunnar's hurt bad. We need you." For a long moment, Bjorn stood torn between the need for revenge and the duty to his followers. Then, with a heavy sigh, he turned back to the group. Leif would face justice another day. For now, his people needed him. As he knelt beside Gunnar's prone form, Bjorn felt the weight of leadership settle even more heavily upon his shoulders. The path ahead was fraught with danger, both from without and within, but he had no choice but to press on. The fate of his people, perhaps of all people, hung in the balance. The wind picked up, driving snow across the blood-stained battlefield. Somewhere in that swirling white, Bjorn knew greater challenges awaited. But for now, he had wounded to tend and hard decisions to make. The frozen wastes had claimed their toll, and Bjorn feared it was only the beginning. The cavern mouth loomed before them, a jagged wound in the mountainside that seemed to swallow all light. Bjorn stood at its threshold, the runes on his skin pulsing with an otherworldly glow. Behind him, his diminished band of followers shifted nervously, their eyes darting between the ominous cave and their leader. "Are you certain this is the place?" Frida asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Bjorn nodded, his jaw set with grim determination. "Aye." The visions were clear. The dwarven smiths of Nidavellir dwell within these halls. Eric stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "And if they're not feeling hospitable? Then we'll have come a long way for nothing," Bjorn replied. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "Stay close and let me do the talking." They entered the cave, the darkness swallowing them whole. For a time, they moved in silence, guided only by the faint glow of Bjorn's runes. Then, suddenly, the passage opened into a vast chamber, illuminated by the orange glow of countless forges. The sound hit them next, a cacophony of hammering, hissing steam, and guttural shouts. And there, scurrying about like ants in a colony, were the dwarves. Short and stocky, with arms like tree trunks and beards that reached their knees, they paid no heed to the newcomers. Bjorn strode forward, his voice booming over the din. "I seek the master smith of Nidavellir." The activity in the forge ground to a halt, hundreds of eyes turning to stare at the intruders. From the back of the chamber, the crowd parted to reveal a dwarf even shorter than the rest, but with a presence that filled the room. "I am Broker, master of this forge," the dwarf said, his voice like gravel in a metal cup. "Who dares to enter our realm uninvited?" Bjorn met the dwarf's gaze steadily. "I am Bjorn Ironside, chosen of Yggdrasil. I come seeking your aid to save my people and all the realms from destruction." A ripple of mutters swept through the assembled dwarves. Broker's eyes narrowed, studying Bjorn intently. "Pretty words, surface dweller. he growled. But why should we care about the troubles of men or gods? Our forges burn eternal, our works unmatched in all the 9 worlds. We need nothing from you. Bjorn felt a moment of panic. He had come so far, endured so much. He couldn't fail now. Then, unbidden, his hand went to a small pouch at his belt. From it, he withdrew a single shimmering leaf. "I bring an offering," Bjorn said, holding the leaf aloft. A piece of Yggdrasil itself, freely given. The reaction was immediate. Dwarves pressed forward, their eyes wide with wonder and greed. Broker himself seemed to tremble, his gnarled hands reaching out before he caught himself. "Impossible," the master smith breathed. "No mortal has ever—" "I speak the truth," Bjorn insisted, "and I offer it in exchange for your aid. Will you help us?" Broker stroked his beard, his mind clearly racing. "Perhaps, but such a gift demands more than mere aid. We will forge for you a weapon of legend, a tool to shape the fate of worlds. But our price is high." Bjorn nodded. "Name it." The dwarf's eyes gleamed. "Your father's sword, the one at your hip, passed down through generations of your line. A blade of men, yes, but one with a history, with power of its own." Bjorn's hand went to the hilt of his sword, feeling the familiar worn grip. This blade had been with him through countless battles, a link to his father and all the warriors of his bloodline. To give it up. But the runes on his skin flared, reminding him of the greater purpose he served. With a heavy heart, Bjorn drew the sword and presented it to Broker. "It is yours," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Now fulfill your end of the bargain." Broker nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "It will be done, but such a forging takes time. You and yours may rest here, but do not interfere with our work." As the dwarves set to their task with fervor, Bjorn and his followers found a quiet corner of the vast chamber to make camp. Hours passed, the constant rhythm of hammers on anvils filling the air. It was Gunnar who first noticed something was amiss. "Bjorn," he whispered, nudging his leader. "The shadows, they're moving." Bjorn looked up sharply, his hand going for a sword that was no longer there. And then he saw them, lithe, dark shapes slipping between the forges, silent as death itself. "Dark elves," Bjorn hissed. "Enemies of the dwarves. They must be after the leaf of Yggdrasil." He raised his voice in warning. "To arms! We're under attack." The chamber erupted into chaos. Dark elves seemed to materialize from every shadow, their blades flashing in the forge light. Dwarves grabbed hammers and tongs, joining the fray with battle cries that shook the very stone. Bjorn found himself weaponless, forced to grapple with a snarling elf bare-handed. His runes blazed, lending him strength, but he was quickly becoming overwhelmed. "Bjorn!" Frida's voice cut through the din. She tossed him a dwarven hammer, its head still glowing red-hot from the forge. He caught it deftly, feeling its weight and balance in an instant. With a roar, Bjorn waded back into the fight, the hammer becoming an extension of his arm. Where it struck, dark elves fell, their shadowy forms dissipating like mist in the sun. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. When it was over, the forge was in disarray, but the dwarves stood victorious. The few remaining dark elves melted away into the shadows, leaving only the sound of labored breathing and the constant hum of the forges. Broker approached Bjorn, his beard singed and a fresh cut above his eye. "You fought well, surface dweller. Perhaps there's more to you than I first thought." Before Bjorn could respond, another dwarf hurried up, cradling something in his arms. "Master," he said to Broker, "it is finished." Broker took the object reverently, then turned to Bjorn. "Your weapon, as promised, though perhaps not what you expected." He held out what appeared to be a delicate silver chain, so fine it seemed it might break at the slightest touch. Bjorn stared at it in confusion. "This is to be our salvation? A piece of jewelry?" Broker's laugh was like rocks in a tumbler. "This is Gleipnir, forged from 6 impossible things. The sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. It may look frail, but it can bind the mightiest of beasts, even perhaps the Fenris wolf itself. As Bjorn took the chain, he felt a surge of power unlike anything he had experienced before. The runes on his skin hummed in harmony with Gleipnir, as if recognizing a kindred magic. Use it wisely, Broker warned, for once used, it can never be unmade. Bjorn nodded solemnly, carefully coiling Gleipnir and storing it in a pouch at his belt. You have my thanks, Master Smith. My father's sword was well traded. As they prepared to leave the dwarven halls, Eric approached Bjorn. So, he said, eyeing the pouch that held Gleipnir, was it worth it? Trading your heritage for a magic string? Bjorn was silent for a long moment, his hand resting on the pouch. Finally, he met Eric's gaze. My father's sword was a link to my past, but this, he patted the pouch, this is a key to our future, and if the visions speak true, it may be the only thing standing between our world and utter destruction. With that, Bjorn led his band back into the winding tunnels, leaving the warmth and clamor of the dwarven forges behind. Ahead lay more dangers, more challenges, but now, with Gleipnir at his side, Bjorn felt a glimmer of hope. The next phase of their quest awaited, and with it the fate of all the realms. The firelight danced across the faces of Bjorn's weary band, casting long shadows into the surrounding forest. They had traveled far since leaving the dwarven forge, but their goal seemed no clearer. Bjorn sat apart from the others, his fingers absently tracing the runes on his arm, lost in thought. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond the fire's glow. In an instant, Bjorn was on his feet, his hand going to Gleipnir at his belt. Who goes there? He called out. Laughter, light and mocking, drifted from the shadows. My, came a silky voice. Such suspicion from one marked by Yggdrasil itself. A figure stepped into the firelight, and Bjorn's breath caught in his throat. The man before him was tall and lithe, with eyes that glinted with barely contained mischief. But it was the way the shadows seemed to cling to him, to twist and change with his every movement that gave away his true nature. Loki, Bjorn breathed, dropping to one knee. The others scrambled to do the same, their faces a mix of awe and fear. The trickster god waved a hand dismissively. Oh, do get up. I have no use for groveling. I'm here on, let's call it a fact-finding mission. Bjorn rose slowly, his eyes never leaving Loki's face. What business does the god of mischief have with us? Loki's grin was sharp enough to cut. Why, your business, of course. Word has reached Asgard of a mortal bearing the mark of Yggdrasil, on a quest to save the 9 realms. Naturally, I had to see for myself. He began to circle Bjorn, studying him like a curiosity in a market stall. I must say, I expected someone a bit more impressive. Tell me, Bjorn Ironside, do you even know what threat you face? Bjorn clenched his fists, fighting down a surge of anger. I know enough. I've seen visions of destruction, of a darkness consuming all. I seek to prevent it. Noble words, Loki mused. But intentions count for little against the forces you'll face. Perhaps I could be persuaded to share what I know, for a price, of course. Eric stepped forward, his hand on his sword hilt. We want no part of your tricks, Loki. Your aid always comes with a hidden barb. Loki's eyes flashed dangerously. Careful, boy. Gods have smote mortals for less. His gaze returned to Bjorn. What say you, chosen one? Will you turn away knowledge that could save your people? Bjorn felt the weight of his followers' eyes upon him. He knew Loki's reputation, the danger of dealing with the trickster. But the runes on his skin hummed, as if urging him forward. Name your price, Bjorn said at last. Loki's smile was triumphant. 3 tasks, Bjorn Ironside. Complete them, and I'll tell you all I know. Fail and, well, let's just say failure would be most unpleasant. Bjorn nodded grimly. I accept. Excellent. Loki clapped his hands, and suddenly the forest around them melted away. They stood instead in a vast empty plain under a starless sky. "Your first task, bring me a feather from the wing of thought." Bjorn blinked, confusion etched on his face. A feather? From thought? But thoughts don't have wings, let alone feathers. Loki merely smiled, settling himself on a throne that materialized from the darkness. "You have, until the non-existent sun rises. Begin." For hours, Bjorn racked his brain, trying to make sense of the impossible task. His followers watched helplessly, their own attempts to aid him rebuffed by an invisible barrier. As Bjorn's frustration grew, he heard Loki speaking softly to his band. "Such a shame," the god sighed. "To follow a leader who can't even solve a simple riddle. Perhaps you'd be better off returning home, forgetting this foolish quest." Bjorn saw doubt creeping into his followers' eyes and felt a stab of panic. Then suddenly a memory surfaced. An old tale his father used to tell about Odin's ravens. "Hugin," Bjorn said aloud. "The raven of thought that flies for Odin. A feather from its wing would be a feather from the wing of thought." As soon as the words left his mouth, a single black feather materialized in his hand. Loki's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Well done," he admitted. "But don't get cocky. Your second task, bring me the sound of a cat's footfall." Again, Bjorn found himself facing a seemingly impossible challenge. How does one capture a sound, let alone one as silent as a cat's step? He paced the empty plain, his mind racing. Behind him, he could hear Loki's honeyed words working on his followers. "He's failing you," the god whispered. "Leading you on a fool's errand while your people suffer. Wouldn't it be easier to just give up?" Bjorn saw Frida and Gunnar exchange uncertain glances and felt a surge of determination. He would not let Loki break them apart. Then, as if in answer to his resolve, he remembered Gleipnir. The dwarves had forged it from impossible things, including the sound of a cat's footfall. With trembling hands, Bjorn uncoiled the magical chain. As he did, the faintest whisper of sound emerged, soft, padding steps that could only belong to a feline. Loki's eyes widened in genuine surprise. "Clever," he admitted. "Very clever indeed. But can you handle the final task?" His grin turned feral. "Bring me your shadow separated from your body." This time Bjorn didn't hesitate. He had begun to understand the nature of Loki's game. These weren't tests of strength or even cunning. They were tests of perception. Bjorn strode confidently to the barrier separating him from his followers. "Frida," he called out, "do you trust me?" She nodded, though uncertainty still lingered in her eyes. "Then catch," Bjorn said, and mimed throwing something to her. To everyone's shock, Frida's hands closed around a dark, writhing shape, Bjorn's shadow torn free from his body. Loki burst into delighted laughter. "Oh, bravo. I haven't been so thoroughly entertained in centuries." With a wave of his hand, the empty plain vanished, and they found themselves back in the forest clearing. "You've passed my test, Bjorn Ironside," Loki said, his tone now serious. "And so, as promised, I'll share what I know. The threat you face, the darkness you've seen in your visions, it's Fenrir." A collective gasp went up from Bjorn's followers. Fenrir, the monstrous wolf of legend said to be bound until Ragnarok itself. "Impossible," Eirik breathed. "Fenrir is chained. The gods themselves bound him." Loki's smile was grim. "And yet he stirs. The chains that bind him weaken, and soon he will break free entirely. When he does, he will devour the sun and moon, plunging the 9 realms into eternal darkness." Bjorn's hand went to Gleipnir at his belt. "Then we must stop him. Rebind him before he can break free completely." Loki raised an eyebrow. A bold plan, but binding Fenrir once nearly cost Tyr his hand. What hope does a mortal have, even one marked by Yggdrasil? "Whatever hope there is," Bjorn replied firmly. "I'll not stand idle while all people face destruction." The trickster god studied Bjorn for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, To everyone's surprise, he bowed slightly. "Perhaps there's more to you than I first thought, Bjorn Ironside. I'll be watching your progress with great interest." And with that, Loki vanished, leaving behind only the echo of his laughter. Bjorn turned to his followers, seeing the mix of fear and determination on their faces. "You've all heard the stakes," he said. "I won't force any of you to continue. This path leads to great danger, perhaps even to our deaths, but it's a path I must walk, for the sake of all the realms. Who stands with me?" One by one, his band stepped forward, pledging their loyalty anew. As they did, Bjorn felt a surge of pride and responsibility. The road ahead would be hard, but with these brave souls at his side and the power of Yggdrasil flowing through him, he dared to hope they might just succeed. With renewed purpose, Bjorn led his followers deeper into the forest, towards their destiny and the greatest challenge any of them had ever faced. The mist clung to the ground like a living thing, writhing and twisting around the feet of Bjorn and his band as they approached the mouth of the cave. The very air seemed to whisper with hidden voices, sending shivers down even the bravest warrior's spine. Bjorn stood at the threshold, his hand resting on Gleipnir. The runes on his skin pulsed with an urgent rhythm, as if warning him of the power that dwelt within. "Are you certain about this?" Eric asked, his voice low and tense. "Seers are known for their tricks and half-truths. We could be walking into a trap." Bjorn turned to face his friend, seeing the concern etched on his weathered face. "We need guidance, Eric. Loki's revelation about Fenrir has left us with more questions than answers. If there's even a chance this seeress can point us in the right direction, we must take it." Frida stepped forward, her hand on the hilt of her sword. "Then let us face her together. Whatever tricks she has, we'll overcome them as one." Bjorn shook his head. "No, this is something I must do alone. The rest of you, wait here. If I'm not back by nightfall..." He paused, weighing his words carefully. "Then return to our people and warn them of what's coming." Before anyone could protest further, Bjorn strode into the cave. The darkness swallowed him whole, the sounds of his companions fading away until all he could hear was the echo of his own footsteps and the pounding of his heart. He walked for what felt like hours, the passage twisting and turning until he lost all sense of direction. Just as he began to wonder if he'd been ensnared in some magical trap, the tunnel opened up into a vast cavern. Hundreds of candles flickered throughout the space, their light reflecting off countless hanging crystals and bones. And there, seated before a great fire pit, was the seeress. She was ancient beyond reckoning, her skin like parchment stretched over bone. But her eyes burned with an inner fire that spoke of power beyond mortal understanding. "Step forward, Bjorn Ironside," she croaked, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "I have been expecting you." Bjorn approached cautiously, his every instinct screaming danger. "Then you know why I've come?" The witch's laugh was a terrible thing, echoing off the cavern walls like the cackle of a dozen crones. "I know many things, Marked One. I see the threads of fate stretching out before you, tangling and twisting. You seek knowledge, guidance in your quest against the great wolf. Can you provide it?" Bjorn asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. The seeress leaned forward, her eyes seeming to peer into Bjorn's very soul. "Knowledge has a price, Bjorn Ironside. Are you willing to pay it?" Bjorn nodded grimly. "Name your price, witch. Gold, jewels, magical artifacts. Whatever you desire, I will find a way to provide it." Again came that terrible laugh. "You think I care for such trinkets? No, Bjorn Ironside. The knowledge you seek requires a greater sacrifice, a life freely given." Bjorn felt as if he'd been struck. "A life? You would have me murder one of my own for your prophecy?" The witch shook her head slowly. "Not murder, sacrifice. One of your followers must willingly give their life to unlock the secrets you seek. Choose wisely, for their blood will fuel the visions that guide your path." Bjorn staggered back, his mind reeling. How could he ask such a thing of his loyal band? They had followed him across ice and fire, faced down gods and monsters. To demand that one of them die for a prophecy that might not even help? I cannot, Bjorn said at last. I'll find another way. He turned to leave, his heart heavy with failure, but as he reached the entrance to the tunnel, a voice called out from the darkness. I volunteer. Eric stepped into the cavern, his face set with grim determination. Bjorn's eyes widened in shock. Eric? How? Why? His oldest friend managed a small smile. Did you think we'd let you face this alone? We drew lots. I won, or lost, depending on how you look at it. Bjorn grabbed Eric's shoulders, shaking him. No, I forbid it. We'll find another way. There must be. There isn't, Eric said softly, cutting him off. You know it as well as I do, Bjorn. Our people are dying. The 9 realms themselves are at stake. If my life can buy the knowledge to save them, it's a small price to pay. Tears stung Bjorn's eyes as he embraced his friend fiercely. You're a better man than I, Eirik. I swear your sacrifice will not be in vain. The seeress watched the exchange with ancient, knowing eyes. The choice is made, she intoned. Let the ritual begin. What followed was a nightmare Bjorn knew would haunt him for the rest of his days. Eric's blood flowed into the fire pit, filling the cavern with acrid smoke. The witch's chants rose to a fever pitch, her body contorting in impossible ways as she channeled powers beyond mortal comprehension. And then, suddenly, silence fell. The smoke coalesced into shapes, visions of things past, present, and yet to come. Bjorn saw great battles, monstrous beasts, and a darkness that threatened to swallow everything. The witch's voice, when it came, seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. Hear me, Bjorn Ironside, and know the path that lies before you. To bind the wolf and save the realms, you must journey to the one place no living soul may tread, Helheim itself. Bjorn's breath caught in his throat. Helheim, the realm of the dishonorable dead, a place of eternal cold and misery. How can I enter the land of the dead while still alive? There is a way, the seeress continued. Seek out the well of Urd, where the Norns weave the threads of fate. There you will find the path to Helheim and the key to Fenrir's defeat. But beware, for the journey will cost you dearly. You will face trials that will break both body and spirit. The smoke swirled, showing Bjorn visions of the challenges ahead, treacherous paths, fearsome guardians, and temptations that could lead him astray. Remember this, the witch's voice grew urgent. In Helheim, trust not your eyes or ears. The dead will seek to keep you among them. Only by holding true to your purpose can you hope to return to the land of the living. With a great whoosh, the smoke dissipated, and the cavern returned to normal. The seeress slumped in her seat, looking even more ancient and frail than before. Bjorn stood silent for a long moment, processing all he had seen and heard. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Is it done? Was Eric's sacrifice enough? The witch nodded slowly. The price is paid, the knowledge given. What you do with it now is up to you, Bjorn Ironside. Bjorn turned to leave, his heart heavy with the weight of prophecy and loss. But the seeress called out one last time. Remember this, Marked One. The future is not set in stone. The visions I have shown you are but one possible path. Your choices, your strength of will, these things can yet change the tapestry of fate. Bjorn nodded grimly, then made his way back through the twisting tunnels. When he emerged from the cave, his remaining followers rushed to meet him, their faces etched with concern. Bjorn, Frida cried. What happened? Where's Eirik? Bjorn met their gazes, and they fell silent, seeing the change in their leader. The man who had entered the cave was not the same one who emerged. There was a hardness in his eyes now, a weight to his bearing that spoke of terrible knowledge and even more terrible choices. Eirik, Bjorn said softly, has given his life so that we might have a chance to save all the realms. He paused, letting the magnitude of the sacrifice sink in. We journey now to the Well of Urd and from there to Helheim itself. A murmur of shock and fear rippled through the group. Gunnar stepped forward, his face pale. Helheim? But that's impossible. No living soul can enter the realm of the dead. Bjorn's hand went to Gleipnir at his belt, feeling the hum of its power. We must find a way. For Eirik. For our people. For all the 9 realms. Who stands with me? One by one, his followers pledged their loyalty anew, though fear and uncertainty were plain on their faces. As they prepared to depart, Bjorn cast one last look at the mouth of the cave. He silently renewed his vow to Eirik, swearing that his friend's sacrifice would not be in vain. The path ahead was dark and fraught with danger, but Bjorn Ironside, marked by Yggdrasil and tempered by loss, was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The fate of all the realms hung in the balance, and he would not falter. The mist clung to Bjorn's skin like a shroud as he stood at the edge of the abyss. Behind him, his diminished band of followers huddled close, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Before them yawned a chasm so deep that its bottom was lost in shadow, a gaping wound in the earth that seemed to swallow all light and hope. "This is madness, Bjorn," Gunnar whispered, his voice trembling. "No living soul has ever entered Helheim and returned." Bjorn turned to face his companions, his jaw set with grim determination. The runes on his skin pulsed with an eerie light, casting strange shadows across his face. "And yet we must try. For Eirik, for our people, for all the 9 realms." He uncoiled Gleipnir from his belt, the impossibly fine chain glimmering in the dim light. The seeress spoke true. This is the hidden path to Helheim, guarded by magics older than the gods themselves. But Gleipnir can bind even that which cannot be bound. With a flick of his wrist, Bjorn cast one end of the chain into the chasm. For a heart-stopping moment it seemed to fall endlessly, then impossibly it caught on something unseen. "Now we descend," Bjorn said, gripping the chain. "Stay close, and whatever you do, do not let go." One by one, they began their perilous climb down into the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, a bone-deep chill that seemed to sap the very life from their bodies. Strange whispers echoed from the depths, carrying snatches of forgotten languages and the laments of the damned. They had been climbing for what felt like hours when Frida's foot slipped. She cried out, nearly losing her grip on Gleipnir. Bjorn's hand shot out, catching her wrist in an iron grip. "I've got you," he grunted, straining to hold her weight. "Don't let go. Don't you dare let go." Frida's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. With a supreme effort, she regained her footing, gasping for breath. "Thank you," she panted. I thought for a moment." Bjorn nodded grimly. "We all did. But we're not done yet. Keep moving." Finally, after what seemed an eternity, they reached the bottom of the chasm. The ground beneath their feet was a sickly gray. Neither solid earth nor true stone. A faint sickly light permeated the air, casting everything in shades of decay. "Welcome to Helheim," Bjorn murmured, his hand instinctively going to Gleipnir. No sooner had the words left his mouth than the attack began. Shades of the unworthy dead materialized from the mists, their forms twisted and horrific. They lunged at Bjorn and his followers with ethereal claws and soundless screams. "Form a circle," Bjorn roared, drawing his sword. The blade seemed to drink in what little light there was, leaving trails of darkness in its wake. "Back to back. Don't let them separate us." The battle that followed was like nothing any of them had ever experienced. Their mortal weapons passed through most of the shades harmlessly, but Bjorn's ruined blade and Gleipnir proved devastatingly effective. Where they struck, the unquiet dead howled in true pain and dissipated like smoke. Gunnar went down under a pile of writhing specters, his screams chilling Bjorn to his core. With a roar of defiance, Bjorn leapt into the fray, Gleipnir whipping around him like a living thing. The magical chain bound the shades, forcing them into corporeal form long enough for Bjorn's blade to find purchase. When it was over, Bjorn and his followers stood panting in a circle of empty mist. Gunnar lay on the ground, his face ashen, but alive. "By the gods," Frida breathed, helping Gunnar to his feet. "What manner of hell is this?" "The kind we must push through," Bjorn replied grimly. "This is but the first of many trials. We must reach the heart of Helheim if we're to find Heimdall's horn." They pressed on through the misty wastes, battling wave after wave of the damned. With each step, Bjorn could feel the weight of Helheim pressing down upon them, threatening to crush their spirits and trap them in this realm of eternal torment. It was as they approached a great obsidian fortress that Bjorn saw him, a tall, broad-shouldered figure standing alone amidst the swirling mists. Even before the shade turned, Bjorn knew who it was. "Father," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. The shade of Ragnar Lothbrok turned, fixing Bjorn with eyes that burned with the fires of Helheim. "My son," he said, his voice carrying the echo of 1,000 broken oaths. "Come to join me in eternal shame?" Bjorn's companions tensed, ready for another fight, but he held up a hand to stay them. "This is my burden to bear," he said softly. Then louder, "I've not come to join you, father. I've come to save the 9 realms." Ragnar's laugh was a hollow, bitter thing. "Save them? You couldn't even save me, boy. You stood by and watched as the serpents devoured me. Where was your vaunted courage then?" The words struck Bjorn like physical blows, reopening old wounds he'd thought long healed. "I was a child," he protested weakly. "There was nothing I could have done." "Lies," Ragnar roared, his form seeming to grow and darken. "You were weak then, and you're weak now. You'll fail, just as you failed me, and all the realms will burn for your cowardice." Bjorn felt something inside him begin to crack. The runes on his skin flickered, their light dimming. Was his father right? Was he truly unworthy of the task set before him? It was Frida's voice that cut through his spiral of doubt. "Bjorn, remember who you are. Remember why we're here." Her words were like a splash of cold water, shocking Bjorn back to his senses. He straightened, meeting his father's shade eye to eye. "No," he said, his voice ringing with newfound strength. "I am not the boy I was, father. I am Bjorn Ironside, chosen of Yggdrasil. I carry the hopes of all the realms, and I will not falter." The runes on his skin blazed to life, their light pushing back the oppressive darkness of Helheim. Ragnar's shade recoiled, hissing in pain or fury. "I forgive you, father," Bjorn continued, taking a step forward, "for your failings and for mine. But I will not be bound by them any longer. My path is my own." With each word, Ragnar's shade seemed to diminish, until at last it was nothing more than a wisp of smoke on the wind. As it faded entirely, Bjorn could have sworn he saw a flicker of pride in those haunted eyes. "Well done," a new voice boomed, shaking the very foundations of Helheim. Before them stood a figure of impossible majesty, Heimdall himself, the all-seeing guardian of Bifrost. "You have proven yourself worthy, Bjorn Ironside," Heimdall continued, his golden eyes seeming to peer into Bjorn's very soul. "Few mortals could have withstood the trials of Helheim. Fewer still could have overcome their deepest fears and regrets." With a gesture, Heimdall produced a great horn, its surface etched with runes of power. "Take this, my horn Gjallarhorn. With it, you may summon the gods themselves to your aid in the battle against Fenrir." As Bjorn reached out to take the horn, the realm around them began to shake violently. Cracks appeared in the ashen ground, spreading rapidly. "Helheim collapses!" Heimdall shouted. "You must return to the world of the living now." "But how?" Gunnar cried, dodging a falling chunk of obsidian. "The path we took is surely destroyed." Heimdall's eyes gleamed. "You have proven yourselves heroes this day. And for heroes, there is always a way." With a blast from Gjallarhorn that shook Bjorn to his very bones, a shimmering portal opened before them. Through it, they could see the green fields of Midgard. "Go," Heimdall commanded. "Your true battle is yet to come." Bjorn hesitated for just a moment, then nodded his thanks to the god. "Come on," he shouted to his followers, "to Midgard and to victory." One by one, they leapt through the portal, leaving the collapsing realm of the dead behind. As Bjorn passed through, the last thing he saw was Heimdall's approving nod, before Helheim and the god vanished in a flash of light. They tumbled onto soft grass, the warm sun of Midgard a shock after the eternal twilight of Helheim. As Bjorn helped his companions to their feet, he felt the weight of Gjallarhorn at his belt and the responsibility it represented. "We did it," Frida said in awe. "We journeyed to Helheim and returned." Bjorn nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, storm clouds gathered, unnatural in their speed and fury. "We did," he agreed, "but our greatest challenge still lies ahead. Fenrir stirs, and the fate of all the realms hangs in the balance." With renewed purpose, Bjorn Ironside led his band onward, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them in the final battle for the 9 realms. The world Bjorn and his companions emerged into was not the one they had left. The sky burned an angry red, great clouds of ash and smoke blotting out the sun. In the distance, they could hear the screams of men and beasts, punctuated by a bone-shaking howl that could only belong to one creature: Fenrir. Bjorn's hand went instinctively to Gjallarhorn at his belt, feeling its power thrumming beneath his fingers. The runes on his skin pulsed in response, a constant reminder of the burden he carried. "By the gods," Gunnar whispered, his face ashen. "How long were we in Helheim?" "It looks as if years have passed." Frida shook her head, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Time moves differently in the realm of the dead. For us, it was mere days. But here..." "It doesn't matter," Bjorn cut in, his voice hard with determination. "What matters is that we're here now, and we have a job to do. We need to get back to our people, rally whatever forces we can, and face Fenrir before it's too late." As if in response to his words, a group of raiders crested a nearby hill. Their eyes were wild, filled with a mixture of terror and bloodlust. At their head rode a man Bjorn had hoped never to see again. "Well, well," the leader called out, a cruel smile twisting his features. "If it isn't Bjorn Ironside, I thought you'd be dead by now chasing your foolish quests." Bjorn's jaw clenched. "Hvitserk, I see you've done well for yourself in our absence." Hvitserk laughed, a sound devoid of any real mirth. "Oh, I have. When the world started going to hell, people needed a strong leader. Someone who wouldn't run off chasing visions and leaving his people to fend for themselves." The accusation stung, but Bjorn pushed the feeling aside. There were more important matters at hand. "We don't have time for this, Hvitserk. Fenrir is free, and if we don't stop him, there won't be a world left for you to rule over." For a moment, something like fear flickered in Hvitserk's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by scorn. "More of your madness." "No, Bjorn. I think it's time we settled our old score once and for all. Men, kill them all, but leave Ironside to me." With a roar, Hvitserk's raiders charged down the hill. Bjorn and his small band found themselves vastly outnumbered, but they had faced worse odds in Helheim itself. "Form up!" Bjorn shouted, drawing his sword. "Gunnar, Frida, watch each other's backs. We fight as one." The clash of steel on steel filled the air as the two groups met. Bjorn's blade, tempered by the fires of Helheim, cut through his opponent's armor like it was parchment. Beside him, Frida moved with the grace of a Valkyrie, her axe singing a deadly song. But for every raider they cut down, 2 more seemed to take their place. Bjorn could feel his strength flagging, the toll of their journey through Helheim weighing heavily upon him. It was Gunnar who turned the tide. With a cry of, "For Eirik!" he charged into the thickest part of the fighting, his massive warhammer sweeping raiders aside like wheat before the scythe. Inspired by his bravery, Bjorn and Frida redoubled their efforts. The runes on Bjorn's skin began to glow with an otherworldly light, and he felt power surging through him unlike anything he had experienced before. With each swing of his sword, bolts of energy lashed out, striking down foes beyond his reach. The raiders, already unnerved by the unnatural state of the world, began to falter in the face of what seemed to them a god made flesh. Through the chaos of battle, Bjorn locked eyes with Hvitserk. His childhood rival, now a warlord hardened by years of conflict, charged towards him with murder in his eyes. Their blades met in a shower of sparks, the clash echoing across the battlefield. Hvitserk was good, better than Bjorn remembered, but he had not journeyed to Helheim and back. He had not been marked by Yggdrasil itself. As they fought, Bjorn spoke, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "It doesn't have to be this way, Hvitserk. Join us. Help us save our people, save the world." Hvitserk spat, pressing his attack with renewed fury. "Save them? You abandoned them. I was the one who protected them while you chased your dreams of glory." Their blades locked, bringing them face to face. Bjorn saw the fear in Hvitserk's eyes then, the desperation of a man trying to hold on to control in a world gone mad. "I never wanted glory," Bjorn said softly. "Only to do what was right. It's not too late, brother. Help us face the true enemy." For a moment, Hvitserk hesitated. In that instant of indecision, Bjorn saw a glimmer of the boy he had once known, before ambition and jealousy had twisted him. But then Hvitserk's face hardened once more. With a roar of rage, he redoubled his attack, forcing Bjorn back step by step. It was Gunnar who turned the tide once more. Seeing his leader in peril, he charged towards Hvitserk, his warhammer raised high. "Bjorn!" Gunnar shouted. "Finish this!" Hvitserk turned at the last moment, his eyes widening in shock, but it was too late. Gunnar's hammer caught him full in the chest, the sickening crunch of breaking bones audible even over the chaos of battle. As Hvitserk fell, his raiders lost what little resolve they had left. They broke and ran, leaving the field to Bjorn and his companions. But victory had come at a terrible cost. Gunnar lay on the ground, Hvitserk's blade buried deep in his side. "No!" Bjorn breathed, rushing to his friend's side. "No, not you too. Gunnar, stay with me." Gunnar coughed, blood staining his lips. Did we win?" Frida knelt beside them, tears streaming down her face. "We won, Gunnar. Thanks to you." Gunnar managed a weak smile. "Good. That's good." His eyes found Bjorn's, filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "You have to keep going, Bjorn. The horn, use it. Save them all." With a final, shuddering breath, Gunnar went still. Bjorn bowed his head, grief threatening to overwhelm him. First Eirik, now Gunnar. How many more would he lose before this was over? Frida's hand on his shoulder brought him back to the present. "Bjorn," she said softly, "we have to move." "Fenrir." As if summoned by his name, another bone-shaking howl split the air. Closer now, much closer than before. Bjorn rose, his face set with grim determination. "You're right. We've no time to mourn. Not yet." He turned to face the direction of the howl, his hand going to Gjallarhorn. But Gunnar's sacrifice won't be in vain. None of them will be. With a deep breath, Bjorn raised the horn to his lips. The sound that emerged was like nothing he had ever heard before, a clarion call that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. As the last note faded, the air before them shimmered. A figure began to take shape, tall, broad-shouldered, with one eye gleaming with ancient wisdom. "Odin," Bjorn breathed, dropping to one knee. Frida quickly followed suit. The All-Father regarded them solemnly. "Rise, Bjorn Ironside. You have called and I have answered. But know this, even the power of the gods may not be enough to stop what is coming." Bjorn stood, meeting Odin's gaze steadily. "Then we'll face it together. For Gunnar, for Eirik, for all those who have fallen, and all those who yet live. We'll face Fenrir, and we'll win." A small smile tugged at Odin's lips. "You have the heart of a true hero, Bjorn Ironside. Very well. Let us go to battle, one last time. As they set off towards the sound of Fenrir's howls, Bjorn felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. The final battle was at hand, and the fate of all the 9 realms hung in the balance. But with Odin at his side, Frida at his back, and the power of Yggdrasil flowing through him, Bjorn dared to hope that they might just emerge victorious. Whatever the outcome, he knew one thing for certain. Songs would be sung of this day for generations to come. The village Bjorn had left behind was no more. In its place stood a sprawling camp, a patchwork of tents and hastily erected shelters stretching as far as the eye could see. The air was thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded and frightened. As Bjorn, Frida, and Odin approached, a hush fell over the camp. Eyes wide with awe and fear turned to regard the strange trio, a man glowing with runic power, a battle-hardened shield maiden, and the unmistakable figure of the All-Father himself. An old man, his face lined with worry and exhaustion, stepped forward. Bjorn? Bjorn Ironside, is that truly you? Bjorn recognized him as Halvard, once the village elder. It is, Halvard. We've returned, and not a moment too soon, it seems. Halvard's eyes darted nervously to Odin before returning to Bjorn. The world has gone mad, Bjorn. Monsters roam the land, the sky burns, and there are whispers. Whispers of Fenrir breaking free. The whispers are true, Bjorn said grimly. But we've come to put an end to it. All of it. A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. Some faces showed hope, others skepticism, and more than a few showed outright fear. Odin stepped forward, his presence causing many to fall to their knees. People of Midgard, his voice boomed, carrying to every corner of the camp. The twilight of the gods is upon us, but fate is not yet set in stone. Rise now, take up your arms, and fight for your world. As if to punctuate Odin's words, a bone-chilling howl split the air. It was closer now, much closer than before. The crowd began to panic, people pushing and shoving in their haste to flee. Enough, Bjorn roared, his voice amplified by the power of his runes. The crowd froze, all eyes turning to him. We don't have time for fear. Every able-bodied warrior, arm yourselves. The rest of you, seek shelter in the caves to the north. Move, now. To Bjorn's surprise and pride, the people obeyed without question. Perhaps they sensed the gravity of the situation, or perhaps the presence of Odin lent weight to his words. Whatever the reason, the camp quickly organized itself, warriors gathering while the young and infirm were led to safety. Frida approached, her face grim. It won't be enough, Bjorn. Even with every warrior here, we're no match for Fenrir. Bjorn nodded, his hand going to Gjallarhorn at his belt. You're right. That's why we're calling for reinforcements. With a deep breath, Bjorn raised the horn to his lips and blew. The sound that emerged was like nothing the mortals had ever heard, a clarion call that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a crack of thunder, the sky itself seemed to split open. From the rift emerged figures of legend: Thor, his hammer crackling with lightning; Tyr, grim-faced and battle-ready; Freya, resplendent in her war gear. God after god appeared, until the field before the camp was filled with divine light. But there was no time for awe or celebration. As the last god stepped through the rift, a shadow fell across the land. Bjorn looked up, his heart freezing in his chest. Fenrir had arrived. The great wolf was larger than Bjorn could have ever imagined. Each of his paws was the size of a longhouse, his fur as black as the void between stars. But it was his eyes that truly struck fear into Bjorn's heart, eyes that burned with hatred and hunger, promising the end of all things. Hold the line, Bjorn shouted, drawing his sword. The runes on his skin blazed to life, filling him with power. For Midgard, for all the realms. With a roar that shook the earth, the battle was joined. Gods and mortals alike charged forward to meet Fenrir's onslaught. Thor's hammer struck with the force of 1,000 thunderbolts, while Tyr's sword cleaved through Fenrir's fur like it was mist. Bjorn found himself fighting alongside legends. He ducked under Fenrir's massive paw, his ruined blade slicing deep into the wolf's flesh. Ichor, black as night, poured from the wound. But for every blow they landed, Fenrir seemed to grow stronger. His jaws snapped shut around an unfortunate warrior, swallowing him whole. With each passing moment, the wolf drew closer to his ultimate goal, the sun and moon themselves. "We can't keep this up forever," Frida shouted, narrowly avoiding a swipe of Fenrir's claws. Bjorn knew she was right. Already he could see gods and warriors alike beginning to falter. Even Odin, mighty as he was, seemed to be tiring. In that moment of desperation, Bjorn's hand brushed against Gleipnir at his belt. The dwarven chain hummed with power, and suddenly, Bjorn understood. "The chain!" he cried out. "Gleipnir can bind him!" Odin's eye widened in realization. Of course, the dwarven chain forged from impossibilities. It may be strong enough to hold him. But there was a problem. To bind Fenrir, they would need to get close, dangerously close. "I'll do it," Bjorn said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "I'm the only one who can wield Gleipnir properly." Frida grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Bjorn, no, it's suicide." He placed a hand on her cheek, allowing himself a moment of tenderness amidst the chaos. "It has to be done, Frida, for all of us." Before she could protest further, Bjorn turned to Odin. "Allfather, I need you and the others to distract Fenrir. Give me an opening." Odin nodded grimly. "It shall be done. May your courage not falter, Bjorn Ironside." With a shout, Odin rallied the gods for one final assault. They charged forward, unleashing the full might of their divine power against Fenrir. Bjorn waited, Gleipnir clutched tightly in his hands. He watched as Thor's hammer struck Fenrir's flank, as Tyr's sword slashed at his eyes. And then, he saw his chance. With a cry that came from the very depths of his soul, Bjorn sprinted forward. The runes on his skin blazed brighter than ever before, lending him speed and strength beyond mortal limits. Fenrir's massive head turned, his burning eyes fixing on Bjorn. The wolf's maw opened wide, ready to swallow him whole. But Bjorn was faster. With a leap that defied reason, he launched himself onto Fenrir's snout. The wolf thrashed, trying to dislodge him, but Bjorn held on with grim determination. "Now," he roared, uncoiling Gleipnir. "Bind him." The dwarven chain seemed to come alive in his hands, whipping out to encircle Fenrir's massive form. Where it touched, Fenrir's fur smoked and sizzled, the impossibilities woven into the chain countering the wolf's own mythic nature. Fenrir howled in pain and fury, thrashing with such force that the earth itself shook. But Gleipnir held firm, tightening with each passing second. Bjorn felt himself slipping, his strength finally giving out. As he fell, he caught a glimpse of the sky, the angry red fading, giving way to clear blue. They had done it. They had saved the world. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the breath from his lungs. As darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, Bjorn saw Frida running towards him, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," he whispered, a smile tugging at his lips. "We really did it." And then, Bjorn Ironside, chosen of Yggdrasil and savior of the 9 realms, closed his eyes and knew no more. The battle was over. Fenrir lay bound once more, his terrifying form slowly shrinking as Gleipnir's magic took hold. The gods gathered around, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and wonder. Frida cradled Bjorn's head in her lap, her tears falling on his still face. "Wake up," she pleaded. "But please, Bjorn, wake up, we won. You can't leave now." Odin approached, his one eye filled with a wisdom beyond mortal understanding. He knelt beside Bjorn's prone form, placing a hand on his chest. "Fear not, shield maiden," the Allfather said softly. "Bjorn Ironside's tale is not yet finished. His courage and sacrifice have earned him a place in legend, and perhaps something more." As Odin spoke, the runes on Bjorn's skin began to glow once more. Color returned to his cheeks, and with a gasping breath, his eyes flew open. "Welcome back, hero," Odin said, a rare smile gracing his weathered features. The 9 realms owe you a debt that can never be repaid. Bjorn sat up slowly, his eyes wide as he took in the scene around him. Fenrir bound, the gods triumphant, and his people emerging from their shelters, faces filled with hope. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Truly over?" Frida laughed through her tears, pulling him into a fierce embrace. "It's over. You did it, Bjorn. You saved us all." As the reality of their victory sank in, cheers erupted from the gathered crowd. Gods and mortals alike raised their voices in celebration, the joy of survival overcoming the weariness of battle. Bjorn stood, leaning on Frida for support. He looked out over the crowd, seeing faces filled with hope and admiration. But he also saw the cost of their victory, the wounded, the dead, the destruction that Fenrir had wrought. "There's much to be done," he said, his voice carrying across the impromptu battlefield. "Our world needs rebuilding, but together, there's nothing we cannot overcome." As the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the scene in golden light, Bjorn felt a sense of peace wash over him. The prophecy was fulfilled, the great wolf bound once more. And though challenges surely lay ahead, he knew that all of them, were ready to face whatever the future might bring. The tale of Bjorn Ironside, the man who bound Fenrir and saved the 9 realms, would be told for generations to come. But for Bjorn himself, the greatest adventure was just beginning. The adventure of building a new world, one free from the shadow of Ragnarok. The world had narrowed to a single point of focus for Bjorn Ironside. The clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, the very gods themselves battling around him. All of it faded into a dull roar at the edges of his consciousness. Before him loomed Fenrir, the great wolf whose coming heralded Ragnarok itself. Bjorn's body screamed in protest with every movement. Blood seeped from a dozen wounds, and he could feel at least 2 ribs shifting in ways they shouldn't. But still he stood. He had to stand. For his people, for the 9 realms, for everything that was and everything that could be. Fenrir's burning gaze fixed upon him, recognition and hatred blazing in those infernal depths. The wolf's maw opened, revealing rows of teeth the size of long swords. "Little mortal." Fenrir's voice rumbled like an avalanche, shaking Bjorn to his very bones. "Do you truly think you can stand against me? I, who am destined to devour the sun and moon." Bjorn spat blood, his grip tightening on Gleipnir. The dwarven chain hummed with power, almost eager for what was to come. "Destiny?" Bjorn called back, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "I've learned a thing or two about destiny on this journey, Wolf. It's not set in stone." Fenrir's laughter was a terrible thing, a sound of rending flesh and splintering bone. Brave words from one so small, but bravery alone will not save you or your pitiful realm. As Fenrir spoke, Bjorn's mind raced. He knew he couldn't overpower the great wolf through strength alone. But perhaps... "If you're so certain of your power," Bjorn shouted, holding up Gleipnir, "then surely you're not afraid of a simple challenge." Fenrir's massive head tilted, curiosity warring with caution in his burning eyes. "What manner of challenge, little mortal?" Bjorn allowed himself a grim smile. This chain was forged by the dwarves of Nidavellir, from things thought impossible. If you're truly as mighty as you claim, surely breaking it would be child's play for you. For a long moment, Fenrir was silent, considering. Bjorn held his breath, acutely aware of how much rested on this gamble. Finally, Fenrir spoke. "Very well, mortal. I'll humor you before I devour you and all you hold dear. Bind me with your little chain, and watch as I shatter it like spider silk." Bjorn's heart leapt, though he kept his face carefully neutral. "As you wish, great Fenrir. But I warn you, once the challenge is accepted, there's no backing out. Are you certain you want to proceed?" Fenrir snarled, impatience clear in every line of his massive form. "Do it, before I lose what little patience I have left." With a nod, Bjorn began to approach. Each step was agony, his battered body protesting every movement. But he pushed through the pain. focused solely on the task at hand. As he drew near, Fenrir lowered his great head, allowing Bjorn to reach his muzzle. The wolf's breath was hot and fetid, reeking of death and decay. But Bjorn did not falter. With practiced movements, he began to wind Gleipnir around Fenrir's snout. The dwarven chain seemed to come alive in his hands, eager to fulfill its purpose. "There," Bjorn said, stepping back as he finished. "Now, mighty Fenrir, show us the full measure of your strength." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a roar that shook the very foundations of the world, Fenrir began to struggle. The great wolf thrashed and howled, his massive form twisting as he fought against Gleipnir's embrace. But the dwarven chain held firm. With each passing second, it seemed to tighten further, binding Fenrir more securely. The wolf's howls of rage turned to whines of pain and fear as he realized the trap he had stumbled into. Bjorn watched, a mixture of triumph and sorrow warring in his heart. They had won, but at what cost? As Gleipnir continued to tighten, he felt a strange tugging sensation in his chest. It was as if some part of him was being drawn into the chain itself. Suddenly, the world around him began to fade. The sounds of battle, the cries of gods and men alike, all of it receded, replaced by an otherworldly silence. Bjorn found himself standing before an impossibly vast tree, its branches stretching up beyond the limits of his vision. "Yggdrasil," he breathed, awe overwhelming him. As he gazed upon the world tree, Bjorn began to see everything: the past, the present, the myriad possible futures, all of it laid out before him like the threads of a great tapestry. He saw the interconnectedness of all things, how the tiniest action could ripple outwards to affect the fate of entire realms. And he saw his own thread, now irrevocably entwined with Fenrir's. The price of binding the great wolf was steep indeed. Bjorn's very life force was now tied to Fenrir's prison. For as long as the wolf remained bound, so too would Bjorn be bound to his duty as guardian. A voice ancient and wise beyond measure whispered in his mind, "You have done well, Bjorn Ironside, but your journey is far from over. Will you accept this burden to stand as a guardian of the 9 realms for all your days?" Bjorn thought of his people, of the friends he had lost along the way, of all that hung in the balance. There was only one answer he could give. "I accept," he said, his voice ringing with certainty. With those words, Bjorn felt something fundamental shift within him. The runes on his skin flared brightly, then seemed to sink beneath his flesh, becoming a part of him in a way they had never been before. The vision of Yggdrasil faded, and Bjorn found himself once more on the battlefield. But everything had changed. Fenrir lay bound and subdued, the great wolf's form already beginning to shrink as Gleipnir's magic took hold. Around him, gods and men alike stared in awe and disbelief. Frida was the first to approach, her eyes wide with a mixture of joy and concern. "Bjorn," she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. Is it truly over?" Bjorn nodded, a weary smile tugging at his lips. "It's over, Frida. Fenrir is bound once more." A cheer went up from the assembled warriors, relief and triumph evident on every face. But Odin, watching from nearby, saw the change in Bjorn. The Allfather approached, his one eye filled with understanding and respect. "You've paid a great price for this victory, Bjorn Ironside," Odin said, his voice pitched for Bjorn's ears alone. "The burden you now bear is not an easy one." Bjorn met the god's gaze steadily. "No, it isn't, but it's a burden I accept willingly, for the good of all the realms." Odin nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Then let it be known, to gods and men alike, Bjorn Ironside stands as a guardian of Yggdrasil, protector of the 9 realms. His name shall be spoken with honor for as long as the world tree stands." As word of Bjorn's new status spread, he found himself surrounded by those eager to offer thanks and praise. But his thoughts were already turning to the future, to the work that lay ahead. In the days and weeks that followed, as the world began the slow process of healing and rebuilding, Bjorn found himself changed in ways both subtle and profound. He could feel the pulse of Yggdrasil in every living thing, could sense the delicate balance that held the 9 realms together. One evening, as he stood watching the sun set over his village, now a bustling center of trade and learning, Frida joined him. She had stood by his side through every challenge, her own strength a constant source of support. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "The choice you made?" Bjorn was silent for a long moment, considering. "No," he said at last. "It's not an easy path, but it's the right one, and I'm not alone on it." Frida's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. "No," she agreed. "You're not alone." As darkness fell and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, Bjorn felt a familiar whisper in the back of his mind. Yggdrasil, ever present, reminding him of the vastness and wonder of existence. He had started this journey as a simple warrior, driven by visions he didn't understand. He ended it as something more, a guardian, a protector, a living link between the mortal world and the cosmic forces that shaped it. The whisper of Yggdrasil had changed him, had shown him truths beyond imagining, but it had also shown him the power of choice, of standing firm in the face of destiny itself. As he gazed up at the stars, Bjorn Ironside smiled. The next chapter of his story, of the world story, was just beginning, and he was ready for whatever challenges it might bring. For he was Bjorn Ironside, chosen of Yggdrasil, guardian of the 9 realms. And as long as he drew breath, he would stand as a bulwark against the darkness, guided by the whispers of the world tree and the strength of his own indomitable spirit. The end, and a new beginning. The cool morning mist clung to the fields as Bjorn trudged through the damp grass, his calloused hands gripping the handle of a weathered scythe. At 17 summers, his broad shoulders and strong arms spoke of years of hard work on his family's farm. Yet, as he rhythmically swung the blade through the tall stalks of barley, his mind wandered far from the familiar fields of his home. Bjorn's blue eyes, the color of a storm-tossed sea, gazed longingly towards the distant fjord. He could just make out the masts of longships bobbing gently in the sheltered waters. The sight made his heart race with a yearning he couldn't quite explain. "Bjorn!" His mother's voice cut through his daydreams. "The day grows old and your work is barely begun." Sighing, Bjorn redoubled his efforts, his muscles straining as he attacked the crop with renewed vigor. "Coming, mother," he called back, though his eyes lingered on the horizon for a moment longer. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a golden glow across the land, Bjorn's younger sister Ingrid came running across the field. Her blonde braids bounced wildly as she shouted, "They're back! Father's ship has been spotted!" Bjorn's heart leapt. Dropping the scythe, he sprinted towards the village, Ingrid struggling to keep up with his long strides. They arrived at the docks just as the magnificent longship glided into the harbor, its dragon-headed prow cutting through the water like a knife. The villagers had gathered, cheering and waving as the raiders returned. Bjorn craned his neck, searching for a glimpse of his father among the sea-weathered faces of the crew. Finally, he spotted him. Storie the Bold, his red beard now streaked with gray, but his eyes as fierce as ever. As soon as the ship was moored, Bjorn rushed forward to greet his father. Storie's face broke into a wide grin as he embraced his son. "By Thor, boy, you've grown again. Soon you'll be taller than your old man." Bjorn beamed with pride, but before he could respond, his mother appeared, her face a mix of joy and worry. "Welcome home, husband," she said, pulling Storie into a tight embrace. "I trust the seas were kind." Storie laughed heartily. "Kind enough, Astrid. And generous, too." He gestured to his men, who were already unloading chests and sacks filled with plunder. "We'll feast well tonight, and there'll be coin enough to see us through the winter." As the family made their way home, Bjorn couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. "Father," he began, his voice eager, "tell me of your journey. What lands did you see? What battles did you fight?" Storie's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Patience, son. All will be revealed at the feast. But I'll tell you this, we sailed further than ever before, to shores where the very air seemed alive with magic. That evening, the great hall was alive with celebration. Fires roared in the hearths, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls adorned with shields and weapons. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and the sound of laughter and song. Bjorn sat at his father's side, hanging on every word as Styrkar regaled the crowd with tales of their voyage. "We came upon a monastery on the coast of Northumbria," he boomed, his voice carrying over the din. "The monks there thought their stone walls would protect them, but they had never faced the fury of Norse warriors." The hall erupted in cheers, but Bjorn noticed his mother's slight frown. He knew she didn't always approve of the raiding, though she understood its necessity. As the night wore on, Bjorn's thoughts drifted once more to the sea. He imagined himself standing at the prow of a ship, wind in his hair, sailing towards unknown adventures. The yearning in his chest grew stronger with each passing moment. Lost in his reverie, Bjorn didn't notice the old man who had taken a seat beside him until he spoke. "You hear it too, don't you, lad?" the elder said, his voice barely above a whisper. Startled, Bjorn turned to face him. It was Olaf One-Eye, the village's oldest and most respected seer. "Hear what, Olaf?" Bjorn asked, confused. The old man's single eye seemed to peer into Bjorn's very soul. "The call of the sea, boy. It's in your blood, just as it was in your father's and his father before him." Bjorn felt a shiver run down his spine. "How did you know?" Olaf chuckled, a dry sound like autumn leaves rustling in the wind. "I've seen that look before, in the eyes of many a young warrior. But in you, it's different." He leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. "There's an old prophecy, you know. Speaks of a novice sailor, one with the sea in his veins and the favor of the gods. One who will sail further than any before him and bring great change to our people." Bjorn's eyes widened. "Surely you don't mean—" "I mean nothing, lad," Olaf interrupted with a wink. "I'm just an old man who's had too much mead. But remember this, the sea calls to those who are meant to answer." With that, the old seer hobbled away, leaving Bjorn lost in thought. The feast continued around him, but he barely noticed, his mind awash with visions of distant shores and glorious adventures. As the celebration began to wind down, Bjorn found himself standing outside the hall, gazing up at the star-filled sky. The cool night air carried the salt scent of the sea, and he could hear the distant crash of waves against the shore. "There you are," came his mother's voice from behind him. Astrid approached, wrapping a warm shawl around her shoulders against the chill. "What troubles you, my son? You should be celebrating with the others." Bjorn turned to face her, seeing the concern in her eyes. He took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would not be easy for her to hear. "Mother, I want to join the next raiding party." Astrid's face fell, a mix of fear and sadness clouding her features. "Bjorn, no, you're not ready. The sea is a harsh mistress and raiding is dangerous work. You could be killed or worse." "But father was no older than I am when he first went to sea," Bjorn protested. "I'm strong. I can fight. I need to do this, mother. I need to answer the call." Astrid reached out, cupping her son's face in her hands. "Oh, my brave boy. I've always known this day would come, but I had hoped for more time." She sighed deeply. "Your father and I will discuss it. But know this, whatever happens, whatever you choose, you will always have a home here." Bjorn pulled his mother into a tight embrace, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension coursing through him. As they stood there under the vast canopy of stars, he knew that his life was about to change forever. The call of the sea was strong, and Bjorn was ready to answer it, come what may. The clash of steel rang out across the training grounds as Bjorn parried a vicious blow from his opponent. Sweat streamed down his face, stinging his eyes, but he refused to yield. With a grunt of effort, he pushed back, his muscles straining against the weight of his shield. "Good," barked Hakon, the village's veteran warrior and weapons master. "Now counter." Seizing the moment, Bjorn stepped in close, ramming his shield into his sparring partner's chest. As the other man stumbled backward, Bjorn brought his wooden practice sword up in a swift arc, stopping just short of his opponent's throat. Håkon nodded approvingly. "Better, boy. You're learning." Bjorn lowered his weapon, chest heaving as he caught his breath. He'd been training relentlessly for weeks from dawn to dusk, determined to prove himself worthy of joining the raid. "Again," Håkon commanded, and Bjorn squared off against his next opponent. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Bjorn's arms began to feel like lead, his legs shaking with exhaustion. But still, he pushed on, driven by an inner fire that wouldn't let him quit. It was late afternoon when Håkon finally called an end to the day's training. "You've done well, Bjorn," the old warrior said, clapping him on the shoulder. "But remember, strength and skill with a blade are only part of what makes a true Viking. You must also learn the ways of the sea." Bjorn nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "I know, Håkon. I'm to meet with Captain Leif at the docks this evening." "Good lad. Now go, rest those muscles. You'll need them tomorrow." As Bjorn made his way through the village, his body aching but his spirit soaring, he caught sight of a familiar figure leaning against a fence post. It was Ulf, the chieftain's son, watching him with narrowed eyes. "Well, if it isn't the farmer boy playing at being a warrior," Ulf called out, his voice dripping with disdain. Bjorn felt his jaw clench but forced himself to remain calm. "I'm not playing at anything, Ulf. I'm preparing to join the raid, same as you." Ulf snorted derisively. "You? On a raid? Don't make me laugh, Bjorn. You belong in the fields with the other thralls, not on a longship with real men." Anger flared in Bjorn's chest, but before he could retort, another voice cut in. "Leave him be, Ulf. Or are you so insecure that you need to belittle others to feel strong?" Both young men turned to see Astrid approaching, her green eyes flashing with annoyance. Ulf's face reddened, whether from anger or embarrassment. Bjorn couldn't tell. "Mind your own business, shield maiden," Ulf spat, but there was less venom in his voice now. Astrid stepped between them, her hand resting casually on the hilt of the knife at her belt. "Bjorn is my friend, which makes this my business. Now run along, Ulf. I'm sure your father needs you to polish his boots or some other important task." With a final glare at both of them, Ulf stalked off, muttering under his breath. Bjorn let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thanks, Astrid, though I could have handled him myself." She smiled, punching him lightly on the arm. "Oh, I know. But why should you have all the fun? Besides, I've been wanting to put Ulf in his place for years." As they walked together towards the docks, Bjorn couldn't help but marvel at how Astrid had changed over the years. They'd grown up together, played as children, but somewhere along the way, she'd transformed from a gangly girl into a fierce and beautiful young woman. The thought made him feel suddenly awkward. "So," Astrid said, breaking into his thoughts, "you're really going through with it? Joining the raid?" Bjorn nodded, his excitement evident in his voice. "Yes, father and mother have given their blessing, though I think mother is still worried." Astrid's expression grew serious. "She has reason to be. The sea is dangerous, Bjorn, and that's before you even reach foreign shores and face enemy warriors." "I know the risks," Bjorn said quietly, "but I have to do this, Astrid. It's like there's something calling to me. I can't explain it, but I know this is my path." They reached the docks, where old Captain Leif was waiting. The grizzled sailor eyed Bjorn critically. "So, you're Sturkar's boy. Think you have what it takes to be a true seafarer, do you?" Bjorn straightened his back, meeting the captain's gaze. "I aim to find out, sir." Leif grunted, a sound that might have been approval. "Well, let's not waste time then. First lesson, knots. A sailor who can't tie a proper knot is worse than useless on a ship." For the next several hours, Bjorn's world narrowed to ropes and knots. His fingers, already sore from sword practice, grew raw and bloody as he struggled to master the intricate patterns Leif demanded. But with each successful knot, Each nod of approval from the old captain, Bjorn felt a surge of pride. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fjord, life finally called an end to the lesson. "You've got a good start, lad," he said gruffly. "Be here at first light tomorrow. We'll see if you can remember any of this when you're dead tired and the ship's pitching beneath your feet." Exhausted but exhilarated, Bjorn made his way back through the village. He was surprised to find Astrid waiting for him near his family's longhouse. "Astrid, what are you doing here?" She shifted nervously, something uncharacteristic for her. I have something for you." From a small pouch at her belt, she produced a pendant, a smooth stone inscribed with runes hanging from a leather cord. "It's a protection charm," she explained, placing it around his neck. "My grandmother made it. She says it will keep you safe on your journey." Bjorn fingered the stone, feeling a warmth that seemed to emanate from within it. "Thank you, Astrid. This means a lot to me." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. But before either could act on it, the moment was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. "Bjorn." It was his father, Sturkar, his voice urgent. "Come inside, son. There's something we need to discuss." Exchanging a puzzled glance with Astrid, Bjorn followed his father into the longhouse. Inside, he found his mother sitting by the hearth, her face pale and worried. "What's going on?" Bjorn asked, a knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. Sturkar took a deep breath, his usually confident demeanor replaced by an air of solemnity. "Son, there's something you need to know before you set sail. Something about our family, our lineage." Bjorn's mother reached out, taking his hand in hers. "We've always known you were special, Bjorn, but it's more than just a mother's love that tells me this." Sturkar nodded, his eyes distant as if looking into the past. "Our line stretches back to the god Njord himself, the lord of the sea and winds. It's why the call of the ocean is so strong in you, why you feel drawn to the waves in a way others can't understand." Bjorn felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath him. "But how? Why haven't you told me this before?" "We wanted to protect you," his mother said softly. "Such knowledge can be a burden, and we feared it might set you apart from others." Sturkar placed a hand on Bjorn's shoulder, his grip firm. "But now, as you prepare to set sail on your first voyage, you need to know the truth. The blood of the gods runs in your veins, son. It gives you great potential, but it also brings great responsibility." As the weight of this revelation settled over him, Bjorn felt a mix of emotions: awe, fear, excitement, and a deep sense of destiny. He thought of Olaf One-Eye's words about the prophecy, of the inexplicable pull he'd always felt towards the sea. "What does this mean for me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sturkar's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of pride and concern. "It means, my son, that your journey may be more than just a raid. The gods may have plans for you that we cannot foresee. You must be ready for anything." As night fell over the village, Bjorn lay awake in his bed, his mind racing with all he had learned. The pendant Astrid had given him seemed to pulse gently against his chest, a reminder of the friendship and love he was leaving behind. But ahead of him lay the open sea, adventure, and a destiny he was only beginning to understand. The dawn broke crisp and clear over the fjord, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Bjorn stood on the dock, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Before him loomed the sleek silhouette of the longship that would carry him to foreign shores and unknown adventures. All around him, the air buzzed with activity. Warriors said their goodbyes to loved ones, checked their weapons one last time, and loaded the last of the supplies onto the ship. Bjorn felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see his father, Sturkar, standing beside him. "Are you ready, son?" Sturkar asked, his voice gruff but tinged with pride. Bjorn nodded, squaring his shoulders. "I am, father." Sturkar pulled him into a fierce embrace. "Remember what I told you. Trust your instincts and may Njord guide your path." As they broke apart, Bjorn saw his mother approaching, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight. "Be safe, my son," she whispered, "and come back to us." "I will, mother. I promise." A horn blew, signaling it was time to depart. With a final look at his parents, Bjorn turned and strode towards the ship. As he climbed aboard, he caught sight of Astrid in the crowd. She raised a hand in farewell, and he touched the runic pendant she had given him, drawing strength from its presence. The ship's captain, a burly man named Ragnar, bellowed orders as the crew prepared to cast off. Bjorn took his place at an oar, his hands gripping the smooth wood with determination. With a chorus of shouts and the rhythmic beat of a drum, the longship glided away from the dock. Cheers erupted from the shore, mingling with cries of farewell. Bjorn's eyes remained fixed on the receding figures of his family until they faded into the distance. As they cleared the mouth of the fjord and entered the open sea, Bjorn felt a surge of exhilaration. The salt spray on his face, the wind in his hair, the endless expanse of water before him. It was everything he had dreamed of and more. His elation was short-lived, however. As the day wore on and the coast disappeared from view, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon. The sea, once calm, grew increasingly choppy. "Storm's coming," grunted the man next to Bjorn, a grizzled veteran named Halfdan. "Better get your sea legs quick, boy." Bjorn opened his mouth to reply, but a sudden lurch of the ship sent his stomach roiling. He barely made it to the side of the vessel before emptying the contents of his stomach into the churning waves. Laughter erupted from some of the crew, but Halfdan merely clapped him on the back. "Happens to the best of us, lad. You'll get used to it." As the storm hit in full force, Bjorn found himself clinging to the ship's rail, his body racked with nausea. Rain lashed at his face, and waves crashed over the side, soaking him to the bone. Through the chaos, he could hear Captain Ragnar shouting orders, struggling to keep the ship on course. Suddenly, a heated argument broke out near the stern. Bjorn looked up to see Ragnar face to face with the ship's navigator, a wiry man named Orm. "You fool!" Ragnar roared, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Your calculations are off. We're miles from where we should be." Orm jabbed a finger at the captain's chest. "My calculations are perfect. It's your steering that's the problem. We should have turned north an hour ago." As the two men continued to bicker, Bjorn noticed with alarm that the ship was drifting dangerously close to a cluster of jagged rocks. Without thinking, he staggered to his feet and shouted, "Rocks to starboard!" His warning came just in time. Ragnar spun around, barking orders to adjust course. The ship groaned as it turned, the hull scraping against stone but avoiding a catastrophic collision. In the aftermath of the near disaster, Ragnar approached Bjorn, his face a mix of gratitude and suspicion. "Good eyes, boy. You may have saved us all. But don't think this means you can challenge my authority or Orm's navigation." Bjorn nodded, too exhausted and relieved to argue. As the storm began to subside, he found his sea legs at last, moving about the ship with growing confidence. The next day dawned clear and calm, the fury of the storm nothing but a memory. As the crew went about their tasks, Bjorn noticed tension brewing between two of the younger warriors, Ulf, the chieftain's son from his village, and a man named Eric. "You lazy dog," Ulf snarled, shoving Eric. "You've been slacking all morning while the rest of us work." Eric, his face flushed with anger, shoved back. "I've done my share and more, you entitled swine." Before Bjorn could react, the two men were grappling, fists flying. The rest of the crew gathered around, some cheering, others trying to separate the combatants. Remembering his father's words about trusting his instincts, Bjorn pushed his way into the fray. With strength born of weeks of training, he managed to wedge himself between Ulf and Eric, forcing them apart. "Enough," he shouted, surprising himself with the authority in his voice. "We're all part of the same crew. If we fight amongst ourselves, how can we hope to face our enemies?" For a moment, silence fell over the deck. Then, to Bjorn's relief, both Ulf and Eric stepped back, the fight going out of them. "The boy's right," rumbled Halfdan, nodding approvingly at Bjorn. "Save your strength for the raids to come." As the crowd dispersed, Bjorn caught approving looks from several crew members. Even Ulf, despite his earlier animosity, gave him a grudging nod of respect. Just as things seemed to be settling down, a commotion arose from below decks. Two crewmen emerged from the hold, dragging a struggling figure between them. "Captain," one called out, "we found this stowaway hiding among the supplies." Ragnar strode forward, his face dark with anger. The crew parted to let him through, and Bjorn craned his neck to catch a glimpse of the intruder. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized the face of the stowaway. It was Astrid. Her green eyes met his, a mixture of defiance and fear in their depths. Bjorn felt a rush of conflicting emotions, joy at seeing her, fear for her safety, and confusion about why she was here. Ragnar loomed over Astrid, his voice a low growl. "Who are you, girl? And what in Odin's name are you doing on my ship?" Astrid lifted her chin, meeting the captain's glare without flinching. "I am Astrid, daughter of Sigrid the Wise. I came because I had a vision of great danger and greater destiny. I saw that my skills would be needed on this voyage." Murmurs rippled through the crew. Bjorn knew that Astrid's mother was renowned for her gift of foresight, but he had never known Astrid to claim such abilities. Ragnar's eyes narrowed. "A vision, you say? And what skills do you bring that could possibly justify stowing away on a warrior's ship?" "I am trained in the healing arts," Astrid replied steadily. "I can read the runes and interpret omens, and I can fight, if need be." The captain considered her words, his expression unreadable. Finally, he turned to address the crew. "What say you, men? Shall we turn back and deliver this girl to her family? Or do we accept her as one of our own, for good or ill?" Bjorn held his breath, his mind racing. He wanted to speak up for Astrid, to vouch for her skills and bravery, but he feared that his support might do more harm than good. To his surprise and relief, it was Halfdan who spoke first. "I say we keep her," the old warrior grunted. "A skilled healer could mean the difference between life and death for many of us before this voyage is done." Others voiced their agreement, though some still grumbled about bad luck and women on ships. In the end, Ragnar nodded grimly. "Very well. You may stay, Astrid, daughter of Sigrid. But know this, you'll work twice as hard as any man here to prove your worth. And if your vision proves false, you'll answer to me." As the crew dispersed once more, Bjorn caught Astrid's eye. She offered him a small smile, and he felt his heart lift. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was glad to have her by his side. The longship sailed on, cutting through the waves towards an uncertain future. Bjorn stood at the rail, watching the endless horizon. The call of the sea sang in his blood, and for the first time, he felt truly alive. With Astrid's unexpected arrival, and the respect he'd begun to earn from the crew, he sensed that this voyage would change him in ways he could not yet imagine. As the sun began to set, painting the sky and sea in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Bjorn silently renewed his vow to make his family proud and to uncover the truth of his divine heritage. The adventure had only just begun. The longship cut through the waves like a knife, its dragon-headed prow rising and falling with each swell. Bjorn stood at the rail, his eyes scanning the horizon. They had been at sea for weeks now, and the initial excitement of the voyage had given way to a gnawing restlessness among the crew. Suddenly, a shout from the lookout shattered the monotony of the day. "Sail ho! Merchant ship to starboard!" The deck erupted into a flurry of activity. Warriors scrambled for their weapons and shields while Captain Ragnar bellowed orders from the stern. "Ready yourselves, men! Today, we claim our prize." Bjorn felt his heart hammering in his chest as he gripped his sword. This was what he had trained for, what he had dreamed of for so long. Yet now that the moment had come, he found himself paralyzed with a mixture of excitement and fear. A hand clasped his shoulder, and he turned to see Halfdan, the grizzled veteran, grinning at him. "First raid, eh, lad? Just remember, they're more afraid of you than you are of them." Bjorn nodded, grateful for the reassurance, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. As they drew closer to the merchant vessel, Bjorn could make out the panic on the faces of its crew. The ship was low in the water, heavy with cargo, and stood little chance against the sleek Norse longship. Captain Ragnar's voice rang out over the sound of creaking wood and splashing waves. "Archers ready. Aim for the crew, but don't damage the cargo." A hail of arrows arced through the air, finding their marks with deadly accuracy. Screams of pain and terror rose from the merchant ship. "Oars, bring us alongside," Ragnar commanded. The longship surged forward, and Bjorn braced himself for impact. With a splintering crash, they collided with the merchant vessel. Grappling hooks flew, binding the two ships together. "Board them!" Ragnar roared. Warriors poured over the side, led by Ulf, the chieftain's son. Bjorn found himself swept along with the tide of men, his feet leaving the familiar deck of the longship for the first time in weeks. The scene that greeted him on the merchant ship was one of chaos and bloodshed. Viking warriors clashed with the desperate crew, steel ringing against steel. The deck was slick with blood and the air filled with battle cries and screams of the dying. Bjorn stood frozen, his sword hanging uselessly at his side. This wasn't like the training grounds back home. This was real and messy and terrifying. A bearded merchant charged at him, swinging a rusty sword wildly. Bjorn raised his shield just in time, the impact jarring his arm to the shoulder. He stumbled backward, nearly losing his footing on the blood-slicked deck. "Fight, you fool!" Ulf's voice cut through the chaos. "Or do you want to die on your first raid?" The taunt snapped Bjorn out of his daze. With a roar that surprised even himself, he surged forward, bringing his sword up in a vicious arc. The merchant's eyes widened in shock as the blade bit deep into his shoulder. He crumpled to the deck, and Bjorn stood over him, panting heavily. But there was no time to dwell on his first kill. The battle raged on around him, and Bjorn found himself swept up in its fury. He fought with a desperate energy, his training taking over where conscious thought failed him. As the fight began to die down, with most of the merchant crew either dead or subdued, Bjorn noticed a glint of metal from the corner of his eye. He turned just in time to see a wounded sailor lunging at him with a dagger. Time seemed to slow. Bjorn knew he couldn't raise his shield or sword quickly enough. He braced for the pain of the blade, only to see the sailor crumple, an axe buried in his back. Behind the fallen man stood Ulf, his face spattered with blood and twisted in a sneer. "That's twice I've saved your worthless hide, farm boy," Ulf spat. "Try not to make it a habit." Before Bjorn could respond, Captain Ragnar's voice boomed across the deck. "The ship is ours. Gather the cargo and any prisoners worth ransoming. We feast tonight." As the adrenaline of battle faded, Bjorn felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He stumbled to the rail, emptying the contents of his stomach into the sea. "First raid sickness," came a sympathetic voice beside him. He looked up to see Astrid, her face pale but composed, a bloodied knife in her hand. "It happens to many. It will pass." Bjorn wiped his mouth, embarrassment coloring his cheeks. "I froze," he admitted. "I could have gotten my shipmates killed." Astrid's eyes softened. "But you didn't. You fought in the end. That's what matters." As they spoke, the rest of the crew busied themselves transferring cargo and binding prisoners. Bjorn could hear Ulf regaling the others with tales of his own prowess in battle, punctuated by mocking jabs at Bjorn's performance. "I don't understand," Bjorn said quietly to Astrid. "I've trained for this. I thought I was ready. But when the moment came..." "Battle is different from training," Astrid replied. "No amount of practice can truly prepare you for the reality of taking a life. But you survived, Bjorn. You'll be stronger for it next time." Her words brought little comfort, but Bjorn nodded gratefully. As they made their way back to the longship, laden with plunder, he caught sight of Halfdan watching him with an unreadable expression. That night, as the crew celebrated their victory with mead and boasts, Bjorn sat apart, lost in thought. The events of the day played over and over in his mind. He had taken his first life, faced his first real battle, and found himself wanting. Captain Ragnar approached, 2 horns of mead in his hands. He offered one to Bjorn, who took it hesitantly. "You did well today, boy," Ragnar said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "First raid is always the hardest. It gets easier." Bjorn looked up, surprise evident on his face. "But I hesitated. I put others in danger." Ragnar shrugged. "Aye, you did, and you'll have to answer for that. But you also fought when it mattered. You're not the first young warrior to freeze in his first battle, and you won't be the last. The question is, what will you do next time?" Before Bjorn could answer, a cry went up from the lookout. "Storm approaching! All hands on deck!" The celebration broke up instantly as men scrambled to secure the ship. Bjorn could see dark clouds gathering on the horizon, flashes of lightning illuminating their ominous shapes. As the wind began to howl and the first drops of rain pelted the deck, Bjorn heard Astrid's voice raised in alarm. "This is no ordinary storm. I've seen this in my visions. We must change course." Captain Ragnar scowled. "And sail where, girl? We're in open water." But Astrid was insistent. "North. We must go north, or the ship will be lost." As the storm hit in full force, Bjorn found himself torn between following the captain's orders and trusting in Astrid's vision. The ship bucked and heaved beneath them, waves crashing over the sides. In the chaos, Bjorn saw other ships of their fleet being tossed about like toys. One moment they were visible through the sheets of rain, the next they were gone, swallowed by the tempest. "We're losing the fleet," someone shouted over the howling wind. Captain Ragnar cursed, his face a mask of fury and fear. "Hold fast, men! We'll weather this storm or die trying." As Bjorn clung to the rigging, fighting to keep his footing on the heaving deck, he caught Astrid's eye. In that moment, he made a decision. Divine blood or not, vision or no vision, he would not freeze again. Whatever challenges this voyage brought, he would face them head on. The longship plunged on through the night, alone now in the vastness of the raging sea. Bjorn gritted his teeth and held on, ready to fight the very elements themselves if need be. The real test, he realized, was only just beginning. The storm had raged for 3 days and nights, tossing the longship about like a child's toy in a tempest. When at last the skies cleared and the seas calmed, the crew found themselves adrift in unfamiliar waters, their ship battered and leaking. Bjorn stood at the prow, his eyes scanning the horizon. The rest of their fleet was nowhere to be seen, lost to the fury of the storm. Behind him he could hear the steady rhythm of men bailing water from the hull. "Land ho!" came a cry from the lookout. "Off the starboard bow!" A ripple of excitement ran through the weary crew. Bjorn squinted against the glare of the sun, making out the hazy outline of a shoreline in the distance. Captain Ragnar strode to the front of the ship, his face grim. "We've no choice but to make for land," he announced. "The ship won't last much longer at sea." As they drew closer to the unknown shore, Bjorn could make out a dense forest stretching as far as the eye could see, broken only by a jagged line of cliffs to the north. It was unlike any land he had ever seen or heard described in the sagas. The longship limped into a sheltered cove, its hull scraping against the sandy bottom as they ran it aground. The crew disembarked with a mixture of relief and trepidation, weapons at the ready. "We need to know what kind of land we've stumbled upon," Ragnar said, his eyes sweeping the tree line warily. "Bjorn, take a small party and scout the area. The rest of us will make camp and see to repairing the ship." Bjorn felt a surge of pride at being chosen for this task, tempered by a healthy dose of apprehension. He nodded. "Yes, Captain. I'll take Halfdan, Eric, and—" He hesitated for a moment before adding, "and Astrid." Ulf sneered from where he stood nearby. "Taking the wench along to hold your hand, farm boy?" Bjorn ignored the jibe, focusing instead on Ragnar's reaction. The captain considered for a moment, then nodded. The girl's knowledge of herbs might prove useful. Go and be back before nightfall. As they prepared to set out, Astrid approached Bjorn. "Thank you for including me," she said softly. Bjorn shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "Your skills might be needed, and besides, you've proven yourself capable enough." They set off into the forest, Halfdan taking the lead with his axe at the ready. The woods were thick and unfamiliar, filled with strange bird calls and the rustle of unseen creatures. After an hour of trekking, they came upon a small clearing. Eric knelt to examine some tracks in the soft earth. "Something's been through here recently," he muttered. "Something big." No sooner had the words left his mouth than a massive shape burst from the undergrowth. It was a bear, larger than any Bjorn had ever seen, its fur a strange, silvery white. With a roar that shook the very trees, it charged straight at them. "Scatter!" Halfdan bellowed, diving to one side. Bjorn grabbed Astrid and rolled, feeling the rush of air as the bear's claws missed them by inches. He scrambled to his feet, drawing his sword. The beast rounded on Eric, who stood frozen in terror. Bjorn didn't hesitate. With a war cry that surprised even himself, he charged forward, bringing his blade down in a vicious arc across the bear's flank. The animal howled in pain and fury, turning its attention to this new threat. Bjorn found himself staring into eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural intelligence. Just as the bear was about to strike, an axe whistled through the air, burying itself in the creature's skull. It crashed to the ground, twitching once before lying still. Halfdan stood panting, his face pale. "By Thor's hammer," he gasped. "What manner of beast was that?" Before anyone could answer, a high-pitched cry echoed through the forest. Dozens of painted figures melted out of the trees, surrounding them with spears and strange, curved throwing sticks. "Skraelingar," Astrid whispered, using the Norse term for the native peoples they sometimes encountered on raids. But these looked unlike any Skraelingar Bjorn had ever heard described. Their skin was dark as night, their bodies adorned with intricate patterns of white paint. They wore cloaks of feathers and carried weapons of polished wood and stone. One of them, taller than the rest and wearing a headdress of brilliant plumes, stepped forward. He spoke in a language none of them understood, gesturing angrily at the dead bear. "I think we've angered them," Eric said unnecessarily, his voice shaking. Bjorn raised his hands slowly, trying to appear non-threatening. "We mean no harm," he said, knowing they couldn't understand his words but hoping his tone might convey the meaning. "The bear attacked us. We only defended ourselves." The leader's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Bjorn thought they might be cut down where they stood. Then Astrid stepped forward, reaching slowly into her pouch. The warriors tensed, but she merely withdrew a handful of dried herbs. With deliberate movements, she knelt and arranged the herbs on the ground in a pattern. Then she began to sing, a haunting melody that seemed to resonate with the very trees around them. The natives' expressions changed from hostility to curiosity. Their leader crouched down, examining the pattern Astrid had made. He looked up at her, saying something in his strange tongue. Astrid met his gaze steadily, then pointed to the bear, mimed eating, and shook her head emphatically. The leader considered for a long moment, then barked an order to his warriors. They lowered their weapons, and some moved forward to examine the bear's carcass. "What did you do?" Bjorn whispered to Astrid. "I used the sacred herbs of my people," she replied softly. "I think they recognized them, or at least the intention behind the offering, and I tried to convey that we won't eat their sacred animal." The tension in the clearing eased somewhat, though Bjorn knew they were far from safe. The native leader gestured for them to follow, his meaning clear. They were to be taken to the tribe's village. As they were led through the forest, Bjorn noticed Eric limping. "Are you injured?" he asked. Eric nodded grimly. "One of their spears grazed me in the confusion. It's nothing." But as they walked, Eric's condition worsened. His face grew pale and sweaty, and he stumbled more frequently. Finally, he collapsed, his breathing labored. "Poison," Astrid said, examining the wound. "Their spears must be treated with some kind of venom." The natives watched impassively as Astrid rummaged through her pouch of herbs. She crushed several leaves together, adding a few drops of water from her water skin to make a paste. This she applied to Eric's wound, murmuring what sounded like a prayer under her breath. For several tense minutes, nothing seemed to happen. Then Eric's breathing eased and some color returned to his cheeks. The native leader nodded approvingly, saying something to his warriors. "I think you've impressed them," Halfdan grunted. They resumed their journey, supporting Eric between them. As they neared the edge of the forest, Bjorn caught sight of something that made him stop in his tracks. There, carved into the face of a cliff, were runes. Norse runes, weathered by time but still clearly visible. "Impossible," he breathed. Astrid followed his gaze, her eyes widening. "Those are ancient," she said. "Older than any I've seen before." Bjorn approached the cliff face, his heart pounding. He traced the runes with his fingers, reading aloud. Here sailed Leif the Lucky, son of Eric the Red, in the year 1000. The implications were staggering. They had stumbled upon a land visited by the legendary Leif Erikson himself, centuries ago. As Bjorn turned to share this revelation with the others, he saw the native warriors watching him with renewed interest. The leader stepped forward, pointing to the runes and then to Bjorn, saying something in his incomprehensible language. "I think," Astrid said slowly, "they believe we've come to fulfill some kind of prophecy." Bjorn felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. He thought of his divine heritage, of the strange sequence of events that had brought them to this unknown shore. Was this the purpose Njord had in mind for him? As they were led towards the native village, the runes etched into the cliff face behind them, Bjorn knew that their adventure was far from over. In fact, it seemed it had only just begun. The forest gave way to a clearing, revealing a village unlike any Bjorn had ever seen. Enormous structures made of wood and animal hides rose before them, smoke curling from holes in their tops. People stopped their tasks to stare at the newcomers, their expressions a mixture of fear and fascination. The longship creaked and groaned as it rode the swells, a testament to the battering it had endured. 2 weeks had passed since their encounter with the mysterious island and its inhabitants, and the crew's initial excitement had given way to a gnawing unease. Bjorn stood at the prow, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The runes they had discovered weighed heavily on his mind, as did the strange dreams that had plagued him since their departure. "Land ho!" came the cry from the lookout, snapping Bjorn out of his reverie. But unlike before, there was no rush of excitement among the crew. Instead, a tense silence fell over the ship. Captain Ragnar strode to the front, his face grim. "We'll make landfall and replenish our supplies," he announced. "Then we'll decide our next move." As they approached the shore, Bjorn could sense the division among the men. Some, like Halfdan, were eager to press on, to seek out the adventures and riches promised by unknown lands. Others, including Ulf, argued vehemently for a return to familiar waters. The ship had barely touched the beach when the arguments began in earnest. "We've sailed farther than any before us," Halfdan exclaimed, his eyes alight with the thrill of discovery. "Who knows what wonders lie ahead?" Ulf sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Wonders? More like demons and curses. We've lost half the fleet, nearly starved, and for what? Some old runes and savage scralings?" The crew gathered around, voices rising as each man voiced his opinion. Bjorn stood apart, torn between his desire for adventure and his duty to the safety of the crew. Astrid approached him, her face troubled. "What do you think, Bjorn? Should we turn back?" Before he could answer, Captain Ragnar's voice boomed out over the cacophony. "Enough. We'll rest here for 3 days. Then I'll make my decision." As night fell and the crew settled around campfires on the beach, Bjorn found sleep elusive. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were vivid and unsettling. He stood in a great hall, its walls adorned with gleaming shields and ancient weapons. At the far end, seated on a throne of gold, was a figure that could only be Odin himself. The Allfather's one eye gleamed with an otherworldly light as he fixed his gaze on Bjorn. "Why do you hesitate, son of Njord?" Odin's voice was like thunder, shaking Bjorn to his very core. "The path of greatness lies before you, yet you cower like a child." Bjorn fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the god's presence. Great Odin, I don't understand. What is my purpose here? Odin rose, towering over Bjorn. Purpose? You forge your own purpose, boy. The blood of gods flows in your veins, yet you let doubt cloud your mind. Are you worthy of your heritage? Before Bjorn could respond, the dream shifted. He was back on the longship, but something was terribly wrong. The sea churned with an unnatural fury, and dark shapes moved beneath the waves. The crew screamed in terror as tentacles as thick as tree trunks rose from the depths, wrapping around the ship. Bjorn awoke with a start, his heart pounding. The camp was quiet save for the gentle lapping of waves on the shore, but the unease from his dream lingered, leaving him shaken and uncertain. The next day brought no relief from the tension that gripped the crew. As Bjorn helped gather firewood, he overheard hushed conversations, whispers of ill omens and curses. Did you hear? One man muttered to another. Eric's wound has reopened and it reeks of foul magic. Aye, his companion replied, and Gunnar swears he saw a sea serpent following the ship yesterday. Bjorn tried to dismiss such talk as mere superstition, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was indeed amiss. The very air seemed charged with an otherworldly energy. As the sun began to set on the second day, disaster struck. A violent storm blew in from nowhere, catching the crew off guard. Men scrambled to secure the ship and save what supplies they could, but the fury of the elements seemed almost personal in its intensity. Lightning struck the mainmast, splitting it down the middle. The crack of thunder that followed was deafening, and for a moment, Bjorn could have sworn he heard laughter mixed with the sound. Cruel, mocking laughter that chilled him to the bone. When the storm finally passed, leaving them battered but alive, the damage was clear. The ship would need extensive repairs before it could sail again. Captain Ragnar called the crew together, his face etched with lines of worry. This changes things, he said grimly. We may have no choice but to... To what? Ulf interrupted, his voice thick with scorn. To admit this entire voyage was folly? To crawl back home with our tails between our legs? Ragnar's eyes flashed dangerously. Watch your tongue, boy. I'm still the captain here. But Ulf was beyond caution now. A captain who leads us to ruin. I say it's time for new leadership. I challenge Bjorn to a holmgang. A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. The holmgang was a sacred duel, used to settle disputes and determine leadership. To refuse would be to admit cowardice. All eyes turned to Bjorn. He felt the weight of their gazes, the expectation and the doubt. In that moment, Odin's words from his dream echoed in his mind. Are you worthy of your heritage? Drawing himself up to his full height, Bjorn met Ulf's glare. I accept your challenge, Ulf. Tomorrow at dawn, we'll let the gods decide. The night passed in a blur of preparation and restless anticipation. Bjorn cleaned and sharpened his sword, trying to clear his mind for the trial ahead. Astrid found him as he sat by a small fire, running a whetstone along the blade's edge. You don't have to do this, she said softly, sitting beside him. Bjorn sighed. I do. It's not just about Ulf's challenge. It's about proving to myself, to all of them, that I belong here, that I'm worthy of this journey. Astrid placed a hand on his arm. You have nothing to prove, Bjorn. Your actions have already shown your worth. He met her gaze, seeing the concern in her eyes. Thank you, Astrid. But this is something I must do. As dawn broke, the crew gathered on the beach. A circle was drawn in the sand, and Bjorn and Ulf took their places at opposite ends. Captain Ragnar stepped forward. This holmgang will determine the leadership of our expedition. The victor will decide our course, whether to continue our journey or to return home. May the gods favor the worthy. Ulf sneered at Bjorn across the circle. Ready to run home to your mother, farm boy? Bjorn said nothing, centering himself as Halfdan had taught him. He could feel the eyes of the crew upon him, could sense their conflicting hopes and fears. Begin! Ragnar's voice rang out. Ulf charged forward with a roar, his axe whistling through the air, Bjorn sidestepped, bringing his sword up in a swift counterstrike. The clash of steel on steel echoed across the beach. They traded blows, neither able to gain a clear advantage. Ulf was stronger, his strikes fueled by rage and resentment. But Bjorn was quicker, his movements more fluid and controlled. As the duel wore on, Bjorn felt a strange calm descend over him. The sounds of the crew faded away, and he became aware of every shift in the sand beneath his feet, every subtle tell in Ulf's stance. Ulf, growing frustrated, launched into a series of wild, powerful swings. Bjorn gave ground, letting his opponent tire himself out. He could see the opening he needed, knew the strike that would end the fight. But as he prepared to deliver the final blow, the ground beneath them trembled. A low rumble filled the air, growing louder by the second. "Landslide!" someone shouted. The duel forgotten, Bjorn and Ulf turned to see a wall of earth and stone hurtling down the nearby cliffs, heading straight for the camp and the beached longship. Without thinking, Bjorn dropped his sword and sprinted toward the ship. He could hear Ulf close behind him, their rivalry set aside in the face of this greater threat. "Everyone to the ship!" Bjorn bellowed. "We need to push it out to sea!" The crew scrambled to obey, throwing their weight against the hull. Bjorn strained alongside them, his muscles burning with effort. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed they would fail. The rumble of the landslide grew deafening, drowning out their shouts of exertion. Then, just as the first rocks began to rain down around them, the ship lurched free of the sand. They leapt aboard as it slid into the waves, carried by the incoming tide. From the relative safety of the water, they watched as the landslide engulfed their camp, burying everything they had left on shore. As the dust settled, an eerie silence fell over the crew. They turned to Bjorn, who stood at the rail, his eyes fixed on the devastated shoreline. Captain Ragnar approached him. "It seems the gods have made their will known," he said quietly. "What say you, Bjorn? What course shall we set?" Bjorn felt the weight of their gazes, the expectation heavy in the air. He thought of his dreams, of Odin's challenge. He thought of the runes they had discovered, and of the vast unknown that lay ahead. Taking a deep breath, he turned to face the crew. "We sail on," he declared, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "The gods have shown us that there is no going back. Our path lies ahead, into uncharted waters. Who among you will join me in seeking out our destiny?" A cheer went up from the men, even Ulf nodding grudgingly in acceptance. As they set about rigging the ship for sail, Bjorn caught Astrid's eye. She smiled at him, a mix of pride and something deeper shining in her gaze. The longship turned its prow to the open sea, leaving the ruins of their camp behind. Bjorn stood at the bow, his heart racing with a sense of purpose he had never known before. Whatever trials lay ahead, he was ready to face them. The longship creaked and groaned as it navigated the narrow strait, fog clinging to the water's surface like a shroud. Sheer cliffs rose on either side, their jagged faces disappearing into the mist above. An eerie silence hung over the crew, broken only by the rhythmic splash of oars and the occasional cry of an unseen bird. Bjorn stood at the prow, his eyes straining to pierce the gloom ahead. The events of the past few days had changed him, awakening something deep within. He could feel the eyes of the crew upon him, their newfound respect mingled with a touch of fear. Captain Ragnar approached, his face grim. "I mislike this place," he muttered. "The old stories speak of a strait guarded by a great serpent. I always thought them nonsense. But now?" Bjorn nodded, understanding the captain's unease. "We've seen stranger things on this voyage. We should be prepared for anything." As if in response to his words, a low rumbling sound echoed through the strait. The oarsmen faltered, exchanging nervous glances. "Steady, men," Bjorn called out. "Keep to your rhythm." Halfdan materialized at Bjorn's side, his weathered face creased with worry. "I've sailed these waters for 30 years, he said quietly, "and I've never known them to be so alive." Before Bjorn could respond, a shout came from the lookout. "Rocks ahead!" Sharp turn to port! Ragnar bellowed orders, and the ship heeled hard to the left. But the fog was thickening, obscuring their view. Bjorn could hear the roar of water against stone growing louder by the second. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Bjorn felt a surge of something coursing through him. His senses sharpened, and suddenly he could see through the fog as clear as day. He could make out the treacherous rocks jutting from the water, the swirling eddies that threatened to dash them to pieces. Without thinking, he seized the steering oar from the astonished helmsman. "Hard to starboard," he roared. "Now!" The crew responded instantly, and the ship pivoted sharply. Bjorn could feel the current fighting against them, but he held firm. They scraped past the rocks with inches to spare, the sound of stone grinding against wood setting everyone's teeth on edge. As they emerged into slightly calmer waters, a collective sigh of relief went up from the crew. Ragnar clapped Bjorn on the shoulder, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and confusion. "How did you see through that fog, lad?" Bjorn shook his head, equally baffled. I'm not sure. It was as if the sea itself was guiding me." A murmur ran through the crew. Some looked at Bjorn with increased respect, while others made signs to ward off evil. Astrid appeared at his side, her face pale but determined. "It's your heritage," she whispered. "The blood of Njord flows strong in you." Before Bjorn could question her further, the ship gave a violent lurch. Men cried out in alarm as something massive struck the hull from below. "To arms!" Ragnar bellowed. "Sea monster!" The fog parted as if torn asunder by an invisible hand, revealing a sight that froze the blood in Bjorn's veins. A tentacle as thick as the mainmast rose from the churning waters, its surface covered in suckers the size of shield bosses. "Kraken!" someone screamed, and panic threatened to overtake the crew. Bjorn's voice cut through the chaos. "Stand fast. We are Vikings, and we fear no beast of land or sea." His words seemed to steel the men's resolve. They grabbed axes and spears, ready to face this nightmare from the depths. The Kraken's attack was swift and merciless. Tentacles lashed out, smashing oars and snatching men from the deck. Bjorn found himself in the thick of the fight, his sword a blur as he hacked at the writhing limbs. "Aim for the eyes," he shouted, remembering a tale from his childhood. "If it has eyes, we can kill it." The battle raged on, man against monster. The ship's hull creaked ominously under the assault, and Bjorn knew they couldn't last much longer. It was then that he saw Astrid, standing amidst the chaos with an otherworldly calm. She raised her arms to the sky, and her form seemed to shimmer and change. Gone was the young woman he had known. In her place stood a warrior maiden, clad in gleaming armor, a spear of lightning clutched in her hand. Great wings unfurled from her back, and her eyes blazed with divine fire. "Valkyrie," Bjorn breathed, understanding dawning on him. Astrid, or whatever she truly was, fixed him with a piercing gaze. "You must embrace your power, Bjorn. Only you can turn the tide of this battle." As if triggered by her words, Bjorn felt that strange energy surging through him once more. But this time, he didn't fight it. He let it fill him, consuming him like wildfire. The world around him seemed to slow, and he could see every movement of the Kraken with crystal clarity. He could feel the currents of the sea, the ebb and flow of the tide, and he knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. Bjorn raised his sword high, his voice ringing out with supernatural power. "Children of Njord, hear me. Lend me your strength." The sea itself seemed to answer his call. A massive wave rose up, lifting the longship clear of the Kraken's grasp. Bjorn directed the wave with his will, sending it crashing down upon the monster. The Kraken thrashed in confusion, its tentacles flailing wildly. Seizing the moment, Bjorn leapt from the ship, his body moving with impossible speed and grace. He landed on one of the creature's massive eyes, driving his sword deep into the glowing orb. A shriek of pain and fury erupted from the depths, so loud it threatened to shatter eardrums. The Kraken's remaining tentacles whipped about in its death throes, threatening to capsize the ship. "Hold on!" Bjorn shouted to the crew as he clung to his sword, still embedded in the monster's eye. With a final earth-shaking bellow, the kraken began to sink beneath the waves. Bjorn kicked free, swimming with all his might back to the ship. Strong hands grabbed him, hauling him aboard just as the last of the tentacles disappeared into the depths. For a long moment, no one spoke. The crew stared at Bjorn in a mixture of awe and fear. He could feel the power still coursing through him, knew that he was changed in ways he didn't yet understand. Captain Ragnar was the first to break the silence. "By all the gods," he whispered, "what manner of man are you, Bjorn?" Before he could answer, Astrid stepped forward. She had returned to her human form, but there was no hiding the otherworldly aura that surrounded her now. "He is the son of Njord," she declared, her voice carrying across the deck, "chosen by the gods to lead us to a new world." Murmurs of astonishment and reverence rippled through the crew. Even Ulf, who had been Bjorn's rival, dropped to one knee in a gesture of fealty. Bjorn looked out over the now calm waters, his mind reeling from all that had transpired. He turned to Astrid, questions burning in his eyes. "You knew," he said softly. "You knew all along what I could become." She nodded, a sad smile on her face. "It was not my place to tell you, Bjorn. You had to discover your power on your own. But now that you have..." She gestured to the horizon where the fog was finally beginning to clear. "Now our true journey begins." As the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating a vista of unknown lands ahead, Bjorn felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. He had unlocked something within himself, something both wondrous and terrifying. But as he looked at the faces of his crew, battered but unbroken, filled with newfound hope and purpose, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. "Set sail," he called out, his voice filled with the authority of his divine heritage. "We have a new world to discover." As the longship surged forward, leaving the serpent's lair behind, Bjorn stood at the prow, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The blood of gods flowed in his veins, and the fate of his people rested on his shoulders. The greatest adventure of his life, of all their lives, was only just beginning. The longship's prow cut through the mist, revealing a shoreline unlike any Bjorn had ever seen. Great cliffs of black rock rose from the sea, their faces scarred by rivers of molten fire. Steam hissed where lava met water, creating a ghostly veil that shrouded the land beyond. "By Thor's hammer," Halfdan breathed, his eyes wide with wonder and fear. "What manner of place is this?" Bjorn stood at the bow, his newfound powers thrumming beneath his skin. He could feel the raw energy of this strange land calling to him, resonating with the divine blood in his veins. "Land of fire and ice," he murmured, the words coming to him as if from a half-remembered dream. "This is where we were meant to be." As they drew closer to shore, shapes began to emerge from the mist. Structures of wood and stone, built in a style unmistakably Norse, and moving among them, figures that could only be people. "Impossible," Captain Ragnar muttered, squinting at the shore. "How could our people have come so far?" Bjorn turned to Astrid, questions burning in his eyes. The Valkyrie met his gaze steadily, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Not everything is as it seems, Bjorn," she said softly. "The world is vaster and stranger than most men know." As the ship beached on the black sand, a group of armed men approached. Their leader, a giant of a man with a beard streaked with gray, called out in a language that was at once familiar and alien, an archaic form of Norse that Bjorn struggled to understand. "Who are you, strangers, who sail under the raven banner?" the man demanded, his hand resting on the hilt of an enormous axe. Bjorn stepped forward, drawing himself up to his full height. "I am Bjorn, son of Styrkar, of the line of Njord. We come seeking new lands and adventures." The giant's eyes widened at Bjorn's words. He turned to his companions, speaking rapidly in their strange dialect. Then, To Bjorn's surprise, he dropped to one knee, bowing his head. "The prophecy," the man said, his voice filled with awe. "You are the one foretold, the son of the sea god come to lead us home." Murmurs rippled through both groups, Bjorn's crew and the strange Norse settlers. Bjorn felt a weight settling on his shoulders, the burden of expectation and destiny. "Rise, friend," he said, extending a hand to the kneeling giant. "Tell me of this prophecy, and of how your people came to be in this land of fire and ice." The man introduced himself as Thorolf Ironfist, chieftain of the settlement they called Niflheim. As Bjorn's crew mingled with the settlers, marveling at the strange sights of this volcanic land, Thorolf led Bjorn and his inner circle to the great hall. Inside, firelight danced on walls adorned with intricate tapestries. Thorolf pointed to one that depicted a ship sailing through a maelstrom, guided by a figure wreathed in sea foam. "Our ancestors came here centuries ago," Thorolf explained, led by a vision from the gods. "They spoke of a time when the old world would be in peril, and a descendant of Njord would come to guide us back to save our people from a great calamity." Bjorn studied the tapestry, his mind reeling. "And you believe I am this descendant? This chosen one?" Thorolf nodded solemnly. "You bear the mark of Njord," he said, gesturing to the strange birthmark on Bjorn's forearm, a swirling pattern that he had always assumed was nothing more than a quirk of nature. "And you come at the foretold time, when the fires beneath the earth grow restless." As if to emphasize his words, a low rumble shook the hall, dust falling from the rafters. Bjorn exchanged a worried glance with Astrid. "The volcano," she said quietly. "It's awakening." Thorolf's expression grew grim. "Aye, and that's not the only danger we face. There's another clan led by a man named Ivar the Boneless. They reject the old ways, scoff at the prophecies. They've been raiding our settlements, growing bolder with each passing season." Bjorn felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered the tales of Ivar, a legendary Viking warrior known for his cunning and cruelty. Ivar the Boneless? But he lived centuries ago. Thorolf shrugged. "Time moves strangely in this land. Perhaps he is a descendant who bears the same name. All I know is that he threatens everything we've built here." As they discussed strategies for defending against Ivar's clan, Bjorn noticed Ulf slipping out of the hall. The man had been uncharacteristically quiet since their arrival, his eyes darting about nervously. "Excuse me," Bjorn said, rising to follow. But before he could reach the door, a commotion erupted outside. Bjorn burst into the open air to find chaos. Warriors bearing unfamiliar sigils were pouring into the settlement, led by a figure that could only be Ivar himself, a man of average height but with a presence that seemed to fill the entire village. And there, at Ivar's side, stood Ulf. "Betrayer!" Halfdan roared, charging forward with his axe raised. Ulf sneered, drawing his sword. "Betrayer? I'm ensuring our survival, old man. Bjorn would lead us to ruin with his talk of prophecies and destiny." Bjorn felt a surge of anger and disappointment. He had thought Ulf's animosity was behind them, but it seemed the man's resentment ran deeper than he had realized. The battle was joined, Norse settler and newcomer alike, fighting side by side against Ivar's warriors. Bjorn found himself at the heart of the melee, his sword flashing as he called upon the power of Njord to strengthen his blows. But even as he fought, he searched frantically for Astrid. He caught glimpses of her, her Valkyrie form blazing with otherworldly light as she struck down foe after foe. Then, suddenly she was gone. A cold laugh cut through the din of battle. Bjorn turned to see Ivar, holding a blade to Astrid's throat. "So this is the great chosen one," Ivar sneered, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Lay down your weapons or watch your Valkyrie bleed." Bjorn felt his heart freeze. He lowered his sword, seeing his companions do the same out of the corner of his eye. "You fool," Astrid spat at Ivar. "You have no idea what forces you're toying with." Ivar merely laughed. "Oh, I think I do. the power of the gods, flowing through the veins of men. I've tasted it myself, girl. And now I'll use it to reshape this world in my image. As Ivar spoke, the ground began to tremble more violently. Cracks appeared in the black rock, steam and sulfurous gases hissing from the depths. Thorolf's voice rang out, filled with dread. The prophecy, the great calamity, it's upon us. Bjorn looked from Ivar to the awakening volcano, his mind racing. He could feel the power of Njord surging within him, stronger than ever before. But was it enough to save them all? You have a choice, son of Njord, Ivar called out, tightening his grip on Astrid. Save your Valkyrie, or save these people. You don't have time for both. As if to emphasize his words, a gout of lava burst from the mountainside, setting nearby buildings ablaze. Screams filled the air as people fled in panic. Bjorn closed his eyes, reaching deep within himself. He thought of everything that had led him to this moment. The call of the sea, the trials they had faced, the prophecy that seemed to hang over them all. When he opened his eyes, they blazed with divine light. You're wrong, Ivar, he said, his voice carrying over the chaos. I don't have to choose. With a gesture, Bjorn called upon the power of the sea. A massive wave rose from the shore, dousing the flames and cooling the advancing lava. At the same time, he reached out with his mind, feeling the currents of power that flowed through the earth itself. Astrid, sensing his intention, drove her elbow into Ivar's stomach. As the warlord doubled over, she broke free, her wings unfurling as she took to the sky. Bjorn focused all his will on the volcano, on the molten fury that threatened to consume them all. He could feel the earth resisting him, the primal forces of creation struggling against his control. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the fate of everyone on the island hung in the balance. Bjorn's companions watched in awe as he stood unmoved amidst the chaos, his body glowing with an inner light. Then, with a sound like the world itself groaning, the tremors began to subside. The flow of lava slowed, then stopped altogether. Steam hissed into the sky as the sea cooled the molten rock, creating new land before their very eyes. As the dust settled, Bjorn sagged to his knees, exhausted beyond measure. Astrid landed beside him, cradling his head in her lap. You did it, she whispered, her eyes shining with pride and something more. You fulfilled the prophecy. Ivar and his warriors, seeing their plans literally go up in smoke, turned to flee. But they found their path blocked by Thorolf and the other settlers, weapons raised. It's over, Ivar, Thorolf growled. Your reign of terror ends here. As Ivar was bound and led away, Ulf approached Bjorn. The betrayer's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, shame, awe, and lingering resentment. I was wrong, Ulf said haltingly. About you. About everything. Bjorn looked up at his former rival, too weary for anger. We all make choices, Ulf. It's what we do after that defines us. As the people of Niflheim began to rebuild, Bjorn stood on a cliff overlooking the sea. The events of the past few days swirled in his mind. The fulfillment of prophecy, the power he had wielded, the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. Astrid joined him, her hand finding his. What now, son of Njord? She asked softly. Bjorn gazed out at the horizon, where the sun was setting in a blaze of color. Now, he said, a smile tugging at his lips. We sail on. There are more lands to discover, more adventures to be had, and maybe, just maybe, we'll find a place to call home. As they turned back to the settlement, Bjorn knew that his journey was far from over. But with his companions by his side and the blood of gods flowing through his veins, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The saga of Bjorn, son of Njord, was only just beginning. The sky dawned blood-red over the island of Niflheim, as if the heavens themselves anticipated the battle to come. Bjorn stood atop the highest point of the settlement, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, he could see the smoke from Ulf's war camps rising like dark fingers clawing at the sky. Beside him, Thorolf Ironfist shifted uneasily. They outnumber us 3-1, the giant rumbled, and Ulf knows our defenses. It will be a hard fight. Bjorn nodded grimly. Aye, but we have something they don't. He turned to face the assembled warriors, a mix of his own crew and the hardy Norsemen of Niflheim. We fight for our home, for our future, and we have the gods on our side. A cheer went up from the crowd, but Bjorn could see the fear in many eyes. He couldn't blame them. Ulf's betrayal had shaken them all, and the odds were indeed grim. Astrid approached, her Valkyrie armor gleaming in the early morning light. The scouts report Ulf's forces are on the move, she said softly. They'll be here by midday. Bjorn took a deep breath, feeling the power of Njord stirring within him. Then we'd best be ready to greet them. As the morning wore on, Bjorn moved among the defenders, offering words of encouragement and checking defenses. He found Halfdan sharpening his axe, the old warrior's face set in grim determination. Never thought I'd die so far from home, Halfdan mused, testing the axe's edge with his thumb. Bjorn clasped his shoulder. We're not dead yet, old friend, and who knows, maybe this is where we were always meant to be. Halfdan chuckled dryly. Aye, maybe so. Well, if this is to be my last battle, I aim to make it one the skalds will sing about for generations. As the sun reached its zenith, a horn blast split the air. Bjorn rushed to the palisade, his heart pounding. There, emerging from the volcanic mists, came Ulf's army. They were a fearsome sight. Hardened warriors from a dozen different clans united under Ulf's banner. And at their head rode Ulf himself, resplendent in armor that seemed to drink in the light. Warriors of Niflheim. Ulf's voice boomed across the field. Throw down your weapons and swear fealty to me, and I will spare your lives. Resist, and you will be destroyed utterly. Bjorn felt a surge of anger at his former companion's arrogance. He stepped forward, his own voice carrying with supernatural power. We will never bow to you, Ulf. You who betrayed your own people for power. Come then if you dare. We stand ready. A roar went up from the defenders, drowning out Ulf's reply. With a gesture, Ulf signaled the attack. The two forces crashed together like thunder, the sound of steel on steel filling the air. Bjorn found himself in the thick of the fight, his sword a blur as he cut down foe after foe. He could feel Njord's power flowing through him, lending strength to his arms and speed to his movements. But even with his divine heritage, the battle was brutal. For every enemy that fell, it seemed two more took their place. Bjorn saw friends and comrades cut down around him, their blood staining the black volcanic sand. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the battlefield, Bjorn realized they were being pushed back. The defenders were fighting valiantly, but Ulf's superior numbers were telling. Fall back to the inner keep, Bjorn shouted, his voice carrying over the din of battle. We'll make our stand there. As they retreated, Bjorn saw Astrid locked in combat with 3 of Ulf's elite warriors. Her Valkyrie form blazed with otherworldly light as she fought, but even she was being overwhelmed. Without thinking, Bjorn charged to her aid. He took down one of her attackers from behind, then engaged the second in a furious exchange of blows. Together, he and Astrid dispatched the remaining foes. But as they turned to join the retreat, Bjorn felt a searing pain in his side. He looked down to see an arrow protruding from a gap in his armor, blood already soaking his tunic. Bjorn! Astrid cried, catching him as he stumbled. He gritted his teeth against the pain. I'm all right. We need to keep moving. But as they reached the inner keep, Bjorn's strength began to fail him. The world swam before his eyes, and he could feel his life ebbing away with each beat of his heart. Astrid laid him down gently, her face a mask of anguish. No, she whispered. Not like this. Not when we've come so far. Bjorn tried to speak, to tell her it was all right, but no words would come. He could hear the sounds of battle drawing nearer. Soon, Ulf's forces would breach the keep. Astrid's eyes blazed with sudden determination. I won't let you die, she said fiercely. Not while I have the power to prevent it. Before Bjorn could protest, Astrid placed her hands on his wound. She began to glow with an intense light, brighter than anything Bjorn had ever seen. He could feel warmth spreading through his body, driving out the cold grip of death. When the light faded, Bjorn's wound was gone. But Astrid had changed. Her wings had vanished, and the otherworldly aura that had always surrounded her was no more. "What have you done?" Bjorn asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Astrid smiled sadly. "What was necessary? My immortality for your life. A fair trade, I think." Before Bjorn could respond, the door to the keep burst open. Ulf strode in, his armor splattered with blood, his eyes wild with triumph. "So the great son of Njord falls at last," Ulf sneered. "I expected more of a challenge." Bjorn struggled to his feet, his strength returning with every passing moment. "The battle's not over yet, Ulf." Ulf's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in anger. "No matter, I'll finish you myself." With a roar, Ulf charged. Bjorn met his attack, their swords clashing with a sound like thunder. They fought their way out of the keep and onto the cliff overlooking the sea, each seeking to gain the advantage. As they battled, the very elements seemed to respond to their conflict. The wind howled around them, and waves crashed against the cliff face with increasing fury. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the two combatants locked in their deadly dance. Ulf was a skilled warrior, fueled by rage and ambition, but Bjorn had the blood of gods in his veins and the fate of two peoples resting on his shoulders. He would not be denied. With a mighty effort, Bjorn disarmed Ulf, sending his sword spinning over the cliff edge. Ulf fell to his knees, defeated at last. "Finish it," Ulf spat, glaring up at Bjorn. "Prove you have what it takes to rule." Bjorn raised his sword, every fiber of his being crying out for vengeance. But then he paused, remembering Astrid's sacrifice, the lessons he had learned on this long journey. "No," Bjorn said, lowering his weapon. "Enough blood has been shed this day. Your reign of terror is over, Ulf. But your life is not mine to take." As if in response to his mercy, the storm began to subside. The clouds parted, revealing a sky painted with the reds and golds of sunset. And there, on the horizon, Bjorn saw a sight that took his breath away. A ship unlike any he had ever seen, its sails gleaming like spun gold, was approaching the island, and standing at its prow was a figure that could only be Njord himself, come to bear witness to his son's triumph. Bjorn fell to his knees in awe, feeling the weight of destiny settling upon him. He had faced his final test, not just of strength or skill, but of character, and in showing mercy, he had proven himself worthy of his divine heritage. As Njord's ship drew near, Bjorn felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to see Astrid, her eyes shining with pride and love. "You did it," she said softly. "You've become the leader you were always meant to be." Bjorn stood, taking Astrid's hand in his. Together, they watched as Njord's ship touched the shore, ready to embrace whatever future the gods had in store for them. The battle was over, but Bjorn knew that his true journey, as a leader, as a man, as a son of gods and mortals, was only just beginning. With Astrid by his side and the wisdom hard-won through trial and sacrifice, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking hues, Bjorn felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had found his place in the world, bridging the gap between God and man, between the old world and the new. Whatever the future held, he would face it with courage, compassion, and the strength of Njord flowing through his veins. The saga of Bjorn, son of Njord, had reached its climax.